It's 9 o'clock. I call this meeting to order. Casey Griffin of our staff will call the roll to establish a quorum. Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Cobbins.
Here.
Ms. Alberson.
Here.
Mr. Holt.
Here.
Mr. Gentile.
Victoria Harpool, designee for Dr. Gentile.
Mr. Jensen.
Here.
Ms. Johnson.
Here.
Ms. Maxwell.
Here.
Ms. McInturf.
Here.
Mr. Mollenauer.
Here.
Mr. Wells.
Here.
Mr. Chairman.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, you have 10 voting members present.
I declare a quorum is present and we are duly convened. We also welcome Mr. Sam Percy representing TDOE. At this time, I get the pleasure again welcoming our two new board members. We did this yesterday in our workshop, but we usually have a broader attendance and during our actual meeting, and I think it's important to first welcome Dr. Ina Maxwell, who spent 33 years as an educator, as a teacher, ESL director, and closed out as Cumberland County Director of Schools. And we're so pleased to have you here. Would you like to say a few words?
Thank you, Chairman Eby. It's great to be here. When I retired 2 years ago from Cumberland County, I had no idea that this is where I would be today, but I'm grateful for the opportunity. I want to thank Speaker Sexton for the appointment, and I appreciate the confidence that he has placed in me to be able to serve on this board. I also want to thank each of you and Chairman Eby for welcoming me, and it's a pleasure to be able to work together for student success. And I'm happy to be here. I want to say thank you to Dr. Morrison and the entire State Board of Education staff. You have been tremendous in welcoming me and just the highest levels of professionalism. So I'm grateful and thankful for the opportunity.
Thank you, and we know that you'll represent the 6th Congressional District very, very well. Also pleased to welcome our new student member, Bonzi Alberson, and she is from senior at Cookeville High School. Go online and look at her resume. It's very, very impressive, and we are so delighted. This student member, again, is in a very important position on our board, and she brings a perspective that the rest of us don't have. Bonzi, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like just to thank the staff and everybody who was at the workshop yesterday. It was wonderful and very insightful, and I'm very excited to see what comes out of our meeting today. Thank you.
We have 3 fairly new board members. Ms. Marsha Johnson, well, she may be an old timer now because she's been, but one thing I like to talk about. When I first became chair of the state board, I thought of an acronym, LEARN, and I pass that on to you. For L stands for listen first. E is to engage only after you've listened. And act is act only after you've listened and engaged. R is to respect. We may not always agree, but we can respect each other's opinion. And then N is to navigate through the process. And I challenge each one of you, as well as all the board members, maybe that N should be next. I think every board member, when they finish their term on the board, should feel very confident, very proud of what they have done and prepared for the next person to take that position, but to feel good that you've made a real contribution. So I challenge each board member to think about that, what they can do. So welcome again. Dr. Morrison.
Thank you, Chairman Eby. I'll just briefly give a recap of our workshop yesterday, which for those of you that were with us was a very full day, as it always is. Lots of great discussions amongst our members and with our partner organizations. We started with a really informative and deep presentation on various literacy initiatives from the Department of Education staff, looking not only at the recent TCAP results in literacy, but also thinking about the screener data that our districts are using now in K through 3, what that tells us about what's working, and also thinking about the connection to educator prep and what that means for our new generation of teachers coming in who are learning the fundamentals of the science of reading and how that will support literacy initiatives across the state. We heard from Dr. David Laird, also at the Department of Education, on standard setting for high school math courses, as well as a reformulated optional grade 2 assessment, and looked at some results there and thought a lot about that very nuanced work that leads up to the standard setting process and what will come before our board today for a vote for high school math and grade 2. We heard from the Department of Labor and Workforce on education to workforce programs, and particularly those that are kind of forward-facing with youth and what that means for our collaboration with that department, what kind of data they're looking at in terms of the P20 system and how that can inform our collective efforts to ensure that students are getting early career exposure and opportunity to think about the connection to their course selection and their ultimate career pathways. We heard from Victoria Harpool at the Higher Ed Commission and some of her colleagues, as well as partners in Lincoln County, both about some of the priorities in the post-secondary arena and how THEC is thinking about their master plan, and particularly the role of student advising in high school, also sometimes in middle school, and how, again, that is helping support students' career pathways. Particularly heard from folks on the ground in Lincoln County about what that looks like under the program Advise Tennessee. So again, it was a really full afternoon of discussions on a myriad of topics that will also be picked up today, I know, in the board meeting items. So yes, thank you for all of you that tuned in, and those PowerPoints are also on our website for those of you that missed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Morrison. So we'll go to our agenda now. Our first item is our consent items. 3 items on our consent items: the adoption of the agenda, the minutes from our May 31st and July 15th meetings, and then the teacher licensure discipline settlement approvals. Do I have a motion to accept the consent items?
So moved.
Vice Chair moves and Mr. Wells seconds. Any further discussion? No discussion. All in favor of approving the consent items as presented signify by saying aye. 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 Opposed? Motion carries. Next item on our agenda are the report items. First item are State Board of Education member reports. Are there some board members who would like to report on activities since our last meeting? Yes, Ms. McInturf.
I was able to do a couple school visits this summer. I was at Carter's Valley in Hawkins County, and then the commissioner and I continued on to Rock Springs Elementary in Sullivan County. They were doing amazing work during their summer school programs, so that was exciting. I don't typically have the availability to go to schools to visit because I am a teacher, but it was eye-opening, and I was so proud of my district. I also got to attend the UT Institute of American Civics Academy for Teachers. That was amazing. I got to listen to Michael Durline present. He did a fabulous job. So it was a great summer for learning.
That's awesome. Very good. Other board members? Yes, Ms. Maxwell.
Mr. Chairman, I visited with the Upper Cumberland Superintendent Study Council on Wednesday and was able to listen to, their getting back to school routine and all the things that are going on there. So it was a nice visit.
Those Superintendent Study Council meetings are very important because hearing what the top items are for the superintendents helps us do our job better. So glad you were able to attend. Any other reports?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Vice Chair Cobbins.
Yes, sir. I had the opportunity to attend the Education Commission of the States Conference in Washington, D.C., and of course had the opportunity to attend workshops on various topics relevant to state boards of education and policymakers across the country, as well as interface with those individuals. And had a very unique opportunity during a social period to recognize that our chair is a world champion in table tennis. He out of a pool of about 30 people, he was down to the final 2. And what was the score? I know you got it memorized.
I lost 15-13. It was 2 out of 3 games, and on the 3rd game, I lost 15-13.
I call him the LeBron James of ping pong. So. And also, I mentioned briefly yesterday the opportunity for the past 5 to 6 months working with stakeholders across the spectrum of higher ed, industry, workforce development, state government, with Tennessee SCORE, looking at quality credentials and how we can create a framework for Tennessee. So there'll be more news about that in the next month or 2.
I will say that the fellow that beat me was probably about 35 years younger than I am, and I think he finally wore me down. Other reports? I would like to report, too, that I attended with Vice Chair and with Dr. Morrison and Michael Durline and Allie, the Education Commission of the States. That's a very good conference. We learned a lot about some of the key items that are going on across the country, very similar to what we have here. Challenges, one of the interesting things had to talk about integrity of students and the importance of teaching integrity and evaluating and basically treating everybody with with common feelings, et cetera, and understanding that. So it was a good conference. Also, I attended the East Corps Superintendent Study Council meeting. Attended 2 conferences on nuclear opportunities. One was in Oak Ridge Nuclear Opportunities Workshop, and one was at Vanderbilt. The governor wants to make Tennessee the #1 nuclear state in the country because of its clean energy, and there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of growth opportunities, and I think THEC just recently approved a nuclear technologies course at Roane State, so I think you'll see a lot of activity in that area. And then finally, I sit on the Government Affairs Committee for NASB. NASB is the National Association for State Boards of Education. We had a committee meeting, again, common things across the state, across the nation. People are talking about cell phone policies, AI policies. All these things are critical as we go through the challenges that we have here in Tennessee, very similar challenges across the country. Any other reports? If not, we'll move on to our next item, Tennessee Investment and Student Act. Ms. Mary Ann Dursky.
We'll start over. Good morning. In 2022, the General Assembly passed the Tennessee Investment in Student Achievement Act, or TISA, which transitioned Tennessee from a resource-based funding formula to a student-based funding formula. The formula is used to generate funding for our schools in the 2024-25 school year and is supported by a $260 million investment of additional state dollars for the 24-25 fiscal year. The only change to the formula this year is an increase in the base funding amount from $6,860 to $7,075 per ADM. The weighted and direct allocation amounts and percentages have remained the same. TCA 49-1-212 requires that the department prepare a fiscal analysis of any policy, rule, or regulation proposed to the State Board of Education. The attachment outlines the TISA allocations each LEA will receive in the 2024-25 school year. This item does not require any LEA to increase the local contribution in order to meet the TISA local contribution requirement. This item is presented for informational purposes only, and no action is required. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
Any questions for Ms. Dursky?
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Oh, yes, Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have just one question. There's a provision that essentially adjusts everyone down in the event that the formula would oversubscribe the budget. Have we, up to this point, and do we anticipate in the future having to implement that provision?
We have not had to implement that, and provided that the General Assembly appropriates sufficient funding, we would not have to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Thank you, Ms. Dursky.
Thank you.
Next report item is Virtual Education Programs Annual Report. Dr. Amy Owen.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Board. It's great to see you all this morning. I'm Dr. Amy Owen, Senior Policy Director with the Department of Education. I'm here today with 2 report items for you. The first one is on virtual education programs, and the second is on the Students with Disabilities Advisory Council report. We'll start with the virtual schools report. By state law, each year the department is charged with producing over 50 reports on just about every topic you can think of. As part of the statutory requirements, some of those reports are also required to be shared with the board. We have historically done that by sending you the digital copy of the report, but today we're happy to join to answer any questions you may have. I will say there are so many department staff who work on producing these reports. I'm really here as a representative of the department to be able to answer high-level questions you have, and that if you have really specific detailed questions, I'll go back to our program staff and make sure we respond to you in writing. So with that, are there any questions about the virtual schools report that you'd like to have answered?
Questions for Dr. Owen? I have a couple of questions. One, I noticed in the report the number of students decreased from 18,000 to 12,600, which is a pretty significant decrease, and yet the number of schools increased from 57 to 59. Do we know why there was such a large decrease?
I think generally coming out of some of the COVID years, the highest year of enrollment was in 2021, 2022, and there may still have been significant parent and student interest in having a full-time virtual option, and that has continued to decrease. Schools and districts have also been taking advantage of more hybrid style programs under the heading of virtual education programs, where a student is taking less than half their courses online. So some students might be finding that that hybrid environment is a better fit for them with extra support rather than full-time virtual schools.
Thank you. Another question is, as you know, we're preparing to look at the DNF hearings next year. Mm-hmm. And if you go back and you look at the 22-23 data, that I think 30% of the schools that would be a F-rated school would be a virtual school. So what accountability is there, and what are we doing to assure that the quality of education of a student who's in a virtual school is getting a quality education? 30% seems pretty high.
It's a great question. It's a two-part answer. So LEAs are the ones that choose to authorize virtual schools. They fill out a school approval form just as if they were opening a new in-person brick and mortar school, and that goes to the department. So it is at the LEA's discretion whether or not to have a virtual school, whether to keep enrollment only within their district, within nearby geographical districts, or open it up to statewide enrollment. So in that sense, they're treated very similarly to a traditional brick and mortar public school. As you see, they earn letter grades, they generate school report cards. There's an additional layer of accountability in state law that if a virtual school earns a TVOS, a growth level of significantly below expectations, a level 1, for 3 consecutive years, the commissioner may either recommend to the LEA that they close the school or institute enrollment caps. So it's a both and. There's accountability at the local board level to decide what they would like to do about the virtual school, and if they have this consistently low performance, there's a mechanism for the state to step in as well.
So if there is that opportunity, is the commissioner looking at executing that opportunity for continual low-performing virtual schools?
I don't want to speak on her behalf or on Deputy Commissioner Piercy's behalf. We are certainly aware of the letter grades and the outcomes for virtual schools, and I know it's accountability for all schools is something that this administration takes very seriously. I will say the department has implemented an increased monitoring process. By state law, all of the teachers at virtual schools have to be endorsed with the correct Tennessee license. They also have to be using state-approved textbooks and instructional materials, or ones that have received a waiver from the state board. So there is an increased focus on making sure that those requirements are met. But I will defer if there's any further comment from the department leadership.
I also probably won't speak for the commissioner too far on that one. What I will say is that I think to the DNF hearings and that piece, it will be interesting to have the conversations about what support strategies are unique to the virtual school environment. And one of the other elements I would bring up just to connect dots between your two questions is that historically when we had very few virtual schools, a handful of them were statewide offerings. And what we saw coming out of the pandemic is a lot of districts filed to open their own schools and target their own populations. Some of those statewide schools have since closed, and I think that is contributing to the decrease in the number of students in them, while you're seeing more schools actually on the list. And that kind of localized movement, I think, will also be an interesting trend for us to study in that piece.
Thank you. And let me also say that at our East Core Superintendent Study Council meeting, I raised this point up, And Dr. John Reiswick, who is the superintendent of Knox County, went back and he looked. Their virtual school is actually a reward school. So all virtual schools are not failing. I want people to understand that. And certainly there is a place in technology for classrooms and virtual technology, et cetera. So, but the more that we can be assured of understanding what's going on to help our students ensure they get a quality education. Thank you. Any other questions for Dr. Owen? All right, you want to go to the next item?
Yes, sir. This is a report from the Advisory Council for the Education of Students with Disabilities, which is a council that convenes regularly throughout the year to advise the department and other stakeholders on progress and challenges with the population of students with disabilities. This type of report, we also facilitate this report for the Dyslexia Advisory Council and several other advisory councils. It's really the council that approves the report, and the department is facilitating the process. So I'm happy to answer questions about it, but again, it is driven by those council members.
Questions for Dr. Owen? Well, I've got a couple.
All right.
When I noticed this data was 2021, 2022, that seems a little bit late or delayed for information. Is there a reason for that? Or?
There is. That's a great question. So every year for federal reporting for IDEA, the state has to report data on students with disabilities, and some of the federal indicators are lagged on a 2-year time frame. It's in part because some of the indicators are looking at what happens with students after they exit the high school setting, and obviously you need to wait a little bit to see what happens to collect that data. So what we're collecting is for the federal timeline, but I understand that that does look kind of delayed from the state perspective. Obviously we disaggregate for students with disabilities on the state report card so we can see more timely data, but that is why this report looks like it's a pretty significant retrospective.
So there will be disaggregated data, make it clear. Okay.
Yes, sir.
And how and when is this advisory council selected and when employed, et cetera?
I might have to turn to Dr. Jennifer Jordan. I believe that the appointments are made by the governor's office. Yep, that's where I was going. The appointments are made by the governor's office, and they need to represent certain groups of stakeholders, such as parents of students with disabilities, individuals with disabilities, higher ed programs, workforce, and so on.
Thank you.
Great.
Other questions? Thank you, Dr. Owen.
All right, thanks, y'all.
Next item are the automatic teacher licensure actions. Mr. Todd Madison, Alex Anderson, and Ryan Shanahan.
Good morning, Todd Madison, Alex Anderson, Ryan Shanahan, Associate Counsels for the Board. The first item we have up for you is automatic licensure actions. State law and board rule require the automatic revocation or automatic permanent revocation of a teacher's license for certain criminal offenses and classifications set forth in law. Each of these individuals has either been convicted of one of the specified criminal offenses or meets the classification as established by DCS. As such, we recommend the approval of these automatic actions.
We have a recommendation to the board. Is there a motion to approve that recommendation?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Mullenhour seconds. Is there any discussion? No discussion. This does require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins.
Aye.
Ms. Alberson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf.
Aye.
Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 10 ayes.
That motion passes. Thank you. Next item are the teacher licensure discipline actions. Again, Mr. Madison.
Thank you. These items are recommendations for licensure action by way of consent order. Each of these individuals has agreed to the proposed action against their license due to alleged misconduct, violation of board rule. As such, we recommend the approval of these actions. We're happy to take any questions you may have.
There's items are being presented to us. Is there, with a recommendation, is there a motion to accept those recommendations? Mr. Wells moves. Is there, Mr. Jensen seconds. Is there any discussion? No discussion. Mr. Griffin, please call the roll.
Mr. Cobbins.
Aye.
Ms. Albertson. Mr. Holt.
Aye.
Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf.
Aye.
Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 10 ayes.
Motion carries. Let me remind each of the board members and all, if you're not speaking, to turn your mic off. We can only have 4 mics on at one time, and so I'll do the same. Next item, items for first action. Professional assessments for teacher educator policy 5105. Ms. Taylor Reed.
Good morning, Taylor Reed, Senior Director of Educator Licensure. Tennessee State Board of Education Professional Assessments for Tennessee Educators Policy 5.105 outlines general assessment requirements as well as pedagogical, specialty area content, and foundational literacy skills assessments. This item proposes the following revision to Section 3, Specialty Area Content Assessments. Identifies the National Evaluation Series, NES, 815 Educational Leadership Assessment as an option for reactivation of an instructional leader license. Clarifies the Education of Young Children, Test Code 5024, under the Early Development and Learning Pre-KK endorsement as an applicable assessment upon licensure renewal for job-embedded candidates. This assessment was inadvertently left off the Early Development and Learning Pre-KK endorsement previously, and adds a previously approved Special Education Foundational Knowledge Test Code 5355 assessment to additional special education endorsement areas to reflect changes in assessments provided by the vendor and includes corresponding acceptance dates. The Department of Education recommends acceptance of this item on first reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for professional assessments for Tennessee Educator Policies 5.105. Is there a motion to accept this recommendation? Mr. Jensen moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Holt seconds. Is there discussion? Questions for Ms. Reed? No questions for Ms. Reed. All in favor then for accepting professional assessments for Tennessee Educator Policy 5.105 on first reading, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Reed. Next item, Educator Licensure Rule 052002, 0303, 0508, and 10. Again, Ms. Reed.
Good morning again. Taylor Reed, Senior Director of Educator Licensure. Tennessee State Board of Education Educator Licensure Rule 05200203 outlines the license types issued in Tennessee and pathways towards licensure. Sections .03 through .08 govern the issuance of various educator licenses. Section .10 outlines the requirements for instructional leader licenses. This item proposes revising Educator Licensure 05200203 sections .03, .05, .08, and .10 to amend degree requirements for licensure issuance to include institutions with regional or national accrediting organizations recognized by the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, known as CHIA, or the United States Department of Education, USDOE. Currently, the rule requires educators to hold degrees from a regionally accredited institution for license issuance. Proposed revisions would allow an individual holding a degree from a nationally accredited institution recognized by CHIA or USDOE to be issued a license provided all other applicable requirements have been met. State board staff will hold a rulemaking hearing between first and final reading for public feedback. The Department of Education recommends acceptance of this item on first reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for Educator Licensure Rule 0520, 02, 03, 03, 05, 08, and 10. Is there a motion to accept the recommendation?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves, and
Second.
Mr. Mullenhour seconds. Any questions or discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I had
Yes, Mr. Jensen.
a question. It's related to this, but more clarification. So when we're talking about qualifications for a teacher. We've had some discussions here over the last several years about getting teachers into areas, and I think of the certified nurse assistant or the welding program or the whatever it might be. Are we looking at how those are dealt with? Because there's a great need in some of these areas, and I'm not sure that we can fulfill that need if we require somebody to go back and get their teaching degree. And I'm not saying they shouldn't. That's not my point. My point is at the focus. It's focus on how do we've got tremendous opportunity. And I was in Rome State. We were there. And they had a guy working, a teacher that had come from Oak Ridge, and he's probably more qualified than anybody that was teaching a course there. And it just seems like we're putting some impedance that, I understand it. I'm not arguing whether teachers need to be qualified. That's not what I'm saying. But there seems to be a need for a workaround or when we can get somebody that, for example, from Oak Ridge has spent their career and they know more about whatever their subject is. How are we addressing that? And you may already be, and I'm just not aware of it. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. So for specifically nursing assistants, welding, et cetera, that falls under the occupational educator license, and that is actually in section 0.04. And so there is no pathway that requires a bachelor's degree or even an education-specific degree for occupational licensure. In fact, there are occupational pathways where they can go through a specific occupational EPP, which can be it varies by institution how many courses are required. And then we recently had Pathway 3 or Pathway C, which just requires certain courses to be present. That would come from the educator preparation realm, such as classroom management, students with disabilities, and a couple other pedagogical courses to provide that pedagogical potential gap. But you are correct, it would allow a potential educator who has that industry experience and that knowledge to come in, take just a few courses, and be able to teach. And then in last year's legislative session, there was a public chapter passed in which an educator who holds an industry certification can in fact teach as long as they are supervised at all times by a licensed educator. So we absolutely understand, and the department continues to explore ways in which we can look at the existing pathways, potentially combine them to meet the needs of everyone, and simplify the system as much as we can, so that rather it's not a barrier to licensure, but what we're actually finding is that it's a barrier in navigating the 29 pathways that we have right now.
Go ahead.
So if we're addressing that, and it sounds like you are, and I'm glad to hear that. I guess I just want to make sure that this is communicated to the leadership at the school district level effectively, so that they really understand. I mean, they got 100 things they're doing a day, but this seems to be a real challenge, at least at the school level, and perhaps the superintendent. I don't know how you're communicating, and I'm not asking. I'm just saying, I would hope that we're really communicating effectively into the schools that pathway is open, and we'll help you figure it out and help you work through it. So thank you.
Mr. Jensen, I think you bring up a very, very good point. And I will remind people that the state board is doing a licensure step back to look and see what we can do and how we can make it easier for people to be licensed without impacting the quality. And maybe Dr. Morrison can kind of tell what's going on there.
Very briefly, and thank you, Ms. Reed, for that explanation, because I think that gets at the heart of your question, Mr. Jensen, around the occupational licensure. And just thinking about that meeting at Roane State, we've been able to make some of the changes that they were requesting specifically at that meeting, which is gratifying. And as you're saying, Chairman Eby, we now have, and Michael, help me, Ms. Reed, help me, it's our licensure working group, I think is what we've called them. But it's essentially part of that step back where we're meeting regularly with stakeholders from across the state, including legislators, because as we know, this is sometimes the purview of law, sometimes the purview of board rule and policy, and trying to create some coherence is difficult, requires bringing everybody together regularly to talk about what those needs are in the licensure areas across the state that we can try to address in partnership with lawmakers. So I think that will put us in a good place as a state to have those regular conversations about what changes are needed. You'll see some of those in the upcoming items today around EdTPA, around national versus regional certification. I mean, we're seeing lots of good groundswell and interest in that area because, of course, we hear from superintendents all the time. You know, they're one of their biggest challenges is trying to find qualified staff. So this is something we're taking very seriously. I'm encouraged by the participation, the excitement around the licensure working group, and I think having that group in perpetuity will really help us to stay on top of this as a board. So thank you for your partnership in that.
Yesterday in our workshop, we had a workshop from the Department of Labor and Economics talking about education and workforce, and we talked about how to collaborate. And if we're doing our mission of preparing students for post-secondary success, we need to understand where the needs are in industry. Industry needs to understand where our challenges are in education. And one thing we'd like to do is how do we figure out to get industry into the schools, you know, so they're teaching the things that our people need. And hopefully this licensure step back, we'll look at areas like that about what we can do to do that. But it's all got to be done with the student in mind. And so very interesting and active things going on in that area, and I think more to come in the future. So, any other further questions or comments? All right, we have on the table a motion and a second for Educator Licensure Rule 0520, 02, 03, 03, 05, 08, and 10. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item is Educator Preparation Rule. Ms. Jennifer Nelson.
Good morning, Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation at the department. The Educator Preparation Rule outlines the educator preparation requirements in Tennessee and approval of educator preparation programs and specialty area programs. This item proposes to amend the approval of EPP rule section and admission to EPP rule section to include regionally and nationally recognized accreditation organizations recognized by the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, what Taylor said, CHIA, or the United States Department of Education. Both CHIA and the U.S. DOE includes a rigorous evaluation of institutions and ensure the standards are enforced effectively. Now I will pass it along to my colleague.
Thanks, Jennifer. Michael Derline, Deputy Executive Director of Policy and Research with the State Board. This is a joint recommendation coming from the department and the board. Last spring, we convened the newly formed Licensure Review Committee, and a big part of that discussion focused on continued use of the EdTPA and how we can better strengthen the clinical practice that teacher candidates go through. Ultimately, we landed in a place with that group where they want to have a pathway where clinical practice would be more rigorous and the EdTPA would not be required. And then also maintain a pathway where EdTPA would still be required and they wouldn't have to meet certain criteria in clinical practice. This recommendation before you is the first step in that process, and that is to require that beginning on July 1st, 2026, clinical mentors who are supporting candidates in the internship clinical practice would have to use a tool that is approved by the Department of Education. So there are a number of tools out there that could be used. But many EPPs have developed them. This would set forth a process by which the department would review those tools, approve them, and would be the first step in a series of recommendations that will come before you probably in the fall. With that, happy to take any questions you all may have.
We have a recommendation for Education Preparation Rule 0520, 02, 04, 04, 08, and 10. Is there a motion to approve as recommended?
So moved, and I have a quick comment.
Okay, Mr. Mullenhour moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice Chair Cobbins seconds. Discussion, Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank Mr. Derline and also Nathan James for the previous item as well as this one. There were a number of members of our kind of broader education community that had been working on some of these issues for years, and I think had been hitting icebergs. And these two members of our team did a great job of helping to not just chip away, but ultimately remove some of those blocks to progress. I just want to thank you guys for the time and energy you put into this thing over the last year and a half, that at least I'm aware that you've been working on it.
Thank you, Mr. Mullenhour. Other questions or comments? No questions or comments. We do have a motion and a second for Education Preparation Rule 0520, 02, 04.04.08, and .10. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item. District and School Operations Equitable Services for Students of Non-Public Schools Rule. Ms. Taylor Jenkins. Mr. Taylor Jenkins.
Good morning, Chairman Eby and members of the board. My name is Taylor Jenkins, and I am the Assistant General Counsel for Special Education at the Department of Education. I am here today to present to you on first read a new rule governing the calculation of proportionate share and the provision of equitable services to students in non-public schools. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and Perkins 5 governing CTE require local education agencies to set aside a proportionate share of the federal funding that they receive to enable students who are enrolled in non-public schools to benefit from that federal funding. Each of those laws require local education agencies to make the funds available to students who are enrolled in private schools, but allow the state educational agency to choose whether those equitable services will also be available to students enrolled in home schools. For many years, the Department of Education has made its position clear that equitable services must be available to students enrolled in home schools, but that has always been set forth simply in guidance and not in rule. The intent of this rule is simply to move what has already been in guidance to rule so that our Federal Programs and Oversight Division does have the ability to enforce this rule. And with that, I am happy to take questions.
We have a recommendation on District and School Operations Equitable Services for Students in Non-Public Schools Rule 05200102.34. Is there a motion to accept this rule?
So moved.
Mr. Mullenhour moves and Mr. Jensen seconds. Okay. Discussion, questions? Mr. Jensen.
I do. We had a situation in Memphis last year where a family has a child that needed to go to a special school, that really there was not an accommodation in a public school. One of the rules that is in there is that they have to have spent a year in a school. I think we're addressing this down in this, in a sense, in this residential mental health facilities where somebody can move immediately into the state and the next day they're funded to go to something across the state line. So, and there's language in there that that precisely deals with this situation where we've got a child who needs to be in a special needs child needs to be in a situation that can address their needs, and yet, as I understand it, it still sits with they got to be in a public school for a year, which for this child in particular, and I know there are more, that is just not acceptable. So I don't know where it fits in this, but I just want to put that before this body to say it seems to me to be something for a lot of families in the state. Now, this child in particular got the waiver and they're where they need to be, but it's my understanding there are a whole lot more kids that don't need to spend a year in public school before they get to the place where they have their needs met. So I'm not asking for an answer. I'm just putting that on the floor and on the table, and for us to make sure that we're thinking about it, what needs to be done to make that accommodation. We can have people going across the state line, and I'm all for that. That they immediately get approved for the funding, and yet we've got families that are here that are citizens that they're struggling to get approval for that funding. So, and it may be y'all may be addressing it. I'm just simply putting it on the table.
Yes, if I could respond to that, Chairman Eby. The statutory requirement that you were referring to about the one full school year comes from our individualized education account statute and rules. So students enrolled in non-public schools are immediately eligible for equitable services. So I think what I'm presenting on today is a distinct issue, but we are more than happy to work with you on that question arising out of the individualized education account program.
And I would appreciate that. The folks that came to me, I think they're okay, but there are apparently a whole lot of others that year is a critical time that they've got to spend in a public school that can't really address their needs. So, and I'd love to work with you on it.
Absolutely.
Further questions or comments? We have a recommendation for district and schools operation equitable services for students in non-public school rules 05200102-3.34. We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. Next item is repeal safety school rule. Ms. Lori Paisley.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Lori Paisley, Assistant Commissioner of the Coordinated School Health Division at Tennessee Department of Education. I'm here to propose an item repealing the State Board School Safety Rule 0520-01-02-0.30 as the requirements for school safety are in law and there is no need to duplicate them in rule. Through the support of Governor Lee and the Tennessee General Assembly, the state has made unprecedented investments in school safety, and the requirements for school safety are included in the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act established specific and consistent requirements for districts related to providing a safe school environment, including the formation of district and school safety teams and requirements for the development of comprehensive safety plans. Furthermore, this rule contains requirements for districts to conduct at least 2 earthquake drills each year if the district is within 100 miles of the New Madrid fault line. Previously, the state law required districts within the New Madrid fault line zone to conduct earthquake drills and required the state board to promulgate rules to effectuate this requirement. The requirement was removed from the law in 2018, and therefore state board rules on earthquake drills for districts within the New Madrid fault line zone are no longer relevant or necessary. State board staff will hold a rulemaking hearing between first and final reading for public feedback. The Department of Education recommends acceptance of this item on first reading, and the state board staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation to repeal school safety rule 05200102.30. Is there a motion to accept this repeal?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Wells seconds. Is there discussion? Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand the reason to remove from rule parts of the rule that mirror the law that has changed, or where the law has been, that law is no longer in effect. The part that I struggle with a little bit is when the law is in effect still, and we have a rule on the books that mirrors the law, removing that rule, just because there are lots of places where our rules just mirror the law. They restate the law in a lot of places. And so I have grappled a little bit with, well, why do we, in particular the AED requirement here, if that's still in law today, I understand removing the earthquake part of it, that's no longer in the law, but if the AED requirement is still in law today, then why do we remove that from the rule when there are lots of other places in our rules where we restate the law? And it seems to me there could be some benefit in having another place that people who are trying to understand what are the rules and laws that I need to ensure I'm complying with, where they can see that, well, we have to have an AED device placed in each school. So I don't know if there's a question as much as just sort of a general concern I have on selective removal of parts of rules that mirror laws that remain in effect. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that, or I just wanted to put that out there to our group.
Ms. Paisley?
I would defer to your legal staff on rule and law, but AEDs are included in the Smart Heart Act that just passed, and we also partner with the Department of Health on the Safe Stars initiative. So when you mention AEDs specifically, and I know you said there are rules that mirror law, I feel that AEDs are covered. However, understand your question about rule and law and would defer to your legal staff.
I think it's a valid question, though, that we should talk to our legal staff about that.
Yeah,
Mr. Chairman.
Just a quick clarifying follow-up on that. And my point that I'm trying to make is not so much a legal point, because I think the law is what the act is going to trump our rules. Our rules need to be in compliance with the law. We understand that. It's just that sometimes when we have a rule that restates the law, we do that a lot, and in my view, there's probably some benefit to having that. And so if we go about kind of removing parts of our rules that restate the law, but we're not going to do that everywhere, then I think we just have to be thoughtful about the way that we're going about kind of plucking out parts of our rules that restate the law if the law remains in effect. So either way, the law is going to be the law. It's more just sort of the benefit of having that restated in our rules for people who are looking there for what requirements they have to comply with.
What's the visibility of it? A lot of districts will look at the rules and they may not look at the law or something. And so
what's the downside with restating it
right.
In our rules as well?
Mr. Jensen.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My district is includes Northwest Tennessee. There's a lake up there that is pretty big, and it was created by an earthquake. And I just want to make sure that as we think about this, as we have public hearings on it, that people are made aware and understand the practical implications, understand rule and law to some degree, but I really want to know if there are practical and unintended consequences that might impact basically a good part of the state in some way. And I don't have a predisposition on that. I just simply am asking, if we're having public hearing on it, do we need to look what could be the outcome of what I would characterize as an unintended consequence?
I think that's a very good comment. I had concern about removing the earthquake drill. I actually experienced a 7.1 earthquake, which is pretty traumatic. And I do know that Reelfoot area up there, the probability of an earthquake is not insignificant. It's pretty significant. And, having training in that, I think, would be of interest, particularly in the areas that have reasonable chance of earthquake.
I think it was at 1812, and the Mississippi River flowed backwards. Yeah. So that, again, I think we need to be careful not to think about the folks that are in schools and if something like that were to occur.
Other questions or comments? This is an item on first reading, so it might be worthwhile to go back, talk to our legal staff about Mr. Holt's comment, and also think about, are there some places where we can at least encourage earthquake drills if we can't require them because the law doesn't require them? I don't know, but we ought to look at it. So we can do that between first and second readings. Any other questions or comments? If none, we have a motion and a second to repeal the school safety rule 05200102.30 on first reading. All in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. And we will look at this between first and second reading. Thank you, Ms. Paisley. Next item is health education core standards. Ms. Lori Paisley, good to see you again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'm Lori Paisley, Assistant Commissioner of Coordinated School Health at the department. TCA 491302A8 authorizes the State Board of Education to set policies governing all academic standards and courses of study in the public schools. Additionally, State Board Rule 0520-01-03-.031 calls for the State Board to adopt standards for each subject area, grades K through 12. The approved standards are to be the basis for planning instructional programs in each local school system. The State Board recently approved revised health education standards at their November 3rd, 2023 meeting. Chapter 571 of the Public Acts of 2024, amended TCA 496-1304A13, to require family life curriculum to provide instruction on the detection, intervention, prevention, and treatment of internet crimes against children involving sexting, sextortion, and the exploitation of a minor. Technology safety standards were included in the recent revision to grades 6 through 8 health education course standards. However, grades 9 through 12 health education course standards do not include technology safety. This item proposes new standards to ensure that students are instructed on internet crimes starting in the 24-25 school year in accordance with Public Chapter 571. This item proposes grammatical and technical corrections to the grades K through 5 and grades 6 through 8 standards that do not change any content. The Department of Education recommends acceptance on this item on first reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for health education course standards on first reading. Is there a motion to accept those standards?
So moved.
Mr. Mullenhour moves. Is there a second? Ms. Johnson seconds. Are there questions or comments? Yeah, Vice Chair Cobbins.
Thank you, Ms. Paisley, for your hard work on this and your team of folks who you collaborate with. I know over the years I've sort of lamented the situation when we read the licensure discipline cases and situations where students are involved in inappropriate relationships, and I think definitely the technology piece and definitely the relationships section address some concerns that I've had for a long time, and I know we addressed that in 23, but I think also with the updates on the technology aspect, it addresses what we know blurred lines exist in all these different shapes, forms, and fashions, and how students interact with each other and adults, unfortunately. So thank you for your hard work.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? I have one question. So you're adding sexting for grades 9 through 12 with a lot of middle school kids now having access to phones, et cetera. Why is that not moved into middle school, or is it? Or
it is in grades 6 through 8. Technology safety standards are in grades 6 through 8.
Okay.
And I also will add, we have standards on social media for grades below 6 through 8. So our K through 5 do have standards on social media. It just teaches about how social media can be a good thing if you use it safely.
Excellent. Thank you. Other questions or comments? We have a recommendation then for health education course standards on first reading. All in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Opposed? Motion carries. Next item is academic and instructional requirements, promotion retention rule, 05200103.16. Dr. Jennifer Jordan.
Good morning, Chairman and Board. I'm here, Jennifer Jordan, Assistant Commissioner of Special Education and Student Supports with the Tennessee Department of Education. Glasses. The State Board's Promotion and Retention Rule 05200103.16 outlines promotion and retention requirements for K-8 students. The rule also details pathways to fourth grade promotion for third grade students who score approaching or below on the ELA portion of the TCAP in accordance with TCA 49-6-3115. This item revises the rule to align with two pieces of legislation passed in the 2024 legislative session. The first is Chapter 829 of the Public Acts of 2024, PC 829, authorizes a parent or guardian of a student enrolled in kindergarten through second grade to elect to retain the student in the student's current grade level if the student has a documented academic or behavior delay, and the parent or guardian believes that the retention may benefit the student. PC 829 requires the State Board of Education to promulgate rules to define a documented academic or behavior delay. A, the rule defines a documented academic delay as a student who is receiving Tier 3 academic interventions through the Response to Instruction and Intervention framework and who currently has a student intervention plan in the area of math or reading or an individualized learning plan for characteristics of dyslexia, which is an ILPD. B, the rule defines it as a documented behavior delay as a student who is receiving Tier 3 behavioral interventions through the Response to Instruction and Intervention framework and who currently has a student intervention plan for behavior. Number 2, Chapter 989 of the Public Acts of 2023, PC 989, amended TCA 49-6-3115 to include a conference pathway for students who do not demonstrate adequate growth on the 4th grade ELA TCAP. Beginning with students in 4th grade in the 2023-24 school year, a conference may be convened for 4th grade students who are required to show academic growth on the 4th grade ELA TCAP to be promoted to 5th grade, but do not demonstrate growth. PC 989 requires that the conference include the following categories of participants: the student's principal, ELA teacher, and parent or legal guardian. A majority of the categories of participants required to be present in the conference are required to make the recommendation to promote to 5th grade with tutoring supports or to retain the student in 4th grade. This item updates the rule to align with PC 989. State Board staff will hold a rulemaking hearing between first and final reading to collect public feedback. The department recommends acceptance of this item on first reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
Thank you. We do have a recommendation on academic and instructional requirements, promotion and retention rule 05200103.16. Is there a motion to accept this recommendation?
So moved.
Ms. McInturf moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice Chair Cobbin seconds. Are there questions? I'm sure Ms. McInturf is delighted to see this one come through.
I am, and I really am appreciative of everything that you all did and the lawmakers did to make this happen. It makes my heart happy that this is on the agenda today. So thank you.
Yes, Ms. Maxwell.
Thank you, Chairman Eby. Dr. Jordan, I'm wondering, just kind of wondering, how with the K through 2 retention, it notes in there that parents are to give a 30-day notice, 30-day calendar days before the end of the school year. How are families going to be made aware of this information?
We're just going to have to create the communication and make sure that we provide that to, obviously, to parents. I'm sure we'll have a pretty comprehensive communication strategy, and we'll start on that ASAP. But we, through multiple avenues, can share that information, both through our family resource centers, also through different avenues that dealing directly with the districts and the schools to clearly explain this rule. And also for families to understand their part in that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll echo Ms. McInturf that I'm glad to see where we are now with this rule and where the law is. And this board has had a lot of discussions. There have been a lot of discussions across the state about it. I have a question about kind of how large this group of students is who's receiving Tier 3 academic interventions. And as kind of a preface for it, we have talked about how it may be better for students, if they are going to be retained in the earlier grades, which this is giving parents the option to do. It's not requiring it. But the students who would otherwise be at risk for retention in 3rd grade or 4th grade are all students who do not score proficient, subject to certain supports that they may receive, their pathways. But I'm curious, kind of that group of students who are not scoring proficient is roughly 60% in the state. How does that compare to the students who are getting Tier 3 academic interventions and then have the option of repeating a grade earlier than 3rd or 4th?
Thank you for that question. So Response to Instruction Intervention has been in effect since 2014. At the State Department, we don't have visibility into the number of students that are receiving Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention. Those decisions are made at the local level. RTI is meant to be fluid and flexible. The practices within the school system is every 4.5 weeks, the teams get together and they discuss individual student data. Based on that data, they make determinations on whether or not they need any kinds of interventions. It may be tutoring, it could be Tier 2 intervention, it could be Tier 3 intervention, it could be a referral for special education. So any of the supports within the school, those are really local decisions. That information is not reported up at this time. So we don't have that information, but they do at the local level. They keep up with that at the local level. I think yesterday I shared a little bit about universal reading screening, that the LEAs report that in K3, but obviously under our RTI framework, there's screening that is done beyond that, but that is at a local level, that data. So to answer your question, I don't know how many students are served in Tier 2 or Tier 3 across the state, because that is something really they don't report up to the state. And again, one reason is we do want that to be a process at the local level that's responsive to students' needs. So that could vary every 4.5 weeks based on the students' current data and their response to that intervention.
Thank you. And under the proposed rule, would it be that they're receiving Tier 3 academic interventions just at the end of the year? So if they could go in and out, or is it at any time during that year where then the parents would have the option?
When the parents make the request within 30 days of the end of the school year, they need to be currently at that time being served in Tier 3 and have either a student intervention plan or ILP for academics or a student intervention plan for behavior supports within Tier 3.
Okay. And I understand that we don't have the data with kind of precise numbers, but would it be right to assume that it's probably not 60% of the students in the state who are receiving Tier 3 academic supports at the end of the academic year?
That would be our hope, yes. So Tier 1 under RTI, RTI is our instructional framework. So Tier 1 is every student. So every student enrolled in our schools receives Tier 1 instruction. Some students need more targeted intervention, and a very few students would need that intensive, more beyond the targeted intervention, so more intensive intervention. So yes, Tier 3 is typically the smallest intervention block in a district or a school.
Okay. I guess my question for this board and for the department too is if we believe that we should be making this option for retention available to families earlier, if we should perhaps consider broadening this. And I just don't have a sense of whether Tier 3 is a large enough group if we don't have the data to know that. And there may be unintended consequences of this, but hearkening back to the discussions we had about perhaps the benefit of at least making the retention option available earlier, should we expand that so we don't have this potentially fairly large group of students who say are scoring approaching and don't have the option for retention, and then they get to 3rd and 4th grade, and then there are the pathways, but they haven't had that option of being retained earlier. So that's kind of wanted to put out there for our board.
Dr. Morrison.
If I could jump in with a question. Thank you, Dr. Gordon, for that. I thought I was on. Additional information. That makes me think just of a couple questions. I mean, this is up on first reading. Have we done any engagement or discussion with districts around this yet? Because as you're describing the Tier 2 and Tier 3 kind of fluidity, I mean, is it something where we would want to say, for example, a student who's been in Tier 3 at any point during that year, or, just to give a little bit more discretion? Obviously, these are decisions, like you said, that will be made at the local level because we don't even know which students would qualify. But I just wonder, potentially, if we haven't done much engagement or discussion yet between first and final, that seems like it would be a good thing to engage in.
Yes, thank you. Let me just clarify one thing is parents currently can request their child be retained in K2. That happens often, and then it's a discussion amongst the, the individuals within that school. So there's nothing that prohibits parents from doing that. At this time, it does go back to an administrative decision, but I would suspect that many administrators would listen to the parent, and if it was a compelling reason to retain, then that decision could be made. So there's nothing that prohibits that, but it is something the parent can do. As far as Tier 3 at any point during the year, the way RTI, basically the purpose of RTI is really that intervention. We intervene. We want to intervene quickly so we can move individuals out of the tier and supports, because when we say, are they responding to the intervention, our goal is to address any of those deficits that are really impacting their progress in Tier 1. So it could be that we had a student in Tier 3 at some point during the year. They were responsive to the intervention, and then they either went back to Tier 1 or they went into Tier 2, which is a lesser level of support. So we've had discussions at the department around, like, when should that request be made, and should it be for any student that was in Tiered 3 instruction during the year. And we can definitely go back and get some stakeholder engagement to ensure that we're, heading in the right direction there. But just because a student is in Tier 3 at some point during the year, we could have done a really good job in intervention, and that is not a deficit anymore.
That makes sense. And I was throwing that out as an example. This is not my area of expertise, but just I think if we could have more engagement with stakeholders about how we're making these definitions, that would be great, just to give us confidence that this is going to have the impact that it needs to have in terms of, discretion at the local level if they see a need, how we're defining that.
We can do that.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yes, Ms. McIntyre.
And also with your question, with Tier 3, it's honestly a manpower situation. When they move down to Tier 3, it's a very small group, and so you've really got to be specific on who really gets that extensive intervention. It's hard. It goes from, 1 to 12 to 1 to 6, depending on the grade level.
Right now, it's for 5th grade, since we're talking just around 5th grade, it's 1 to 5. In Tier 2, if it's the intervention is provided 5 days a week for at least 30 minutes. For Tier 3, it's actually 1 to 3. If the intervention is provided 40 to 60 minutes, 5 days a week. So in the newest, in the update of the RTI framework, we really tried to focus on decreasing that teacher to student ratio. We know that's the most effective, but it does go back to manpower. Tier 3 should be, besides special education and specialized instruction, the most intensive throughout the RTI framework. So we want very targeted interventions, but we also want a very low teacher-student ratio. So the recommendations are either 1 to 5, depending on if it's 3 days a week, or 1 to 3. 1 to 5 if it's 5 days a week, 1 to 3 if it's 3 days a week.
And also wanted to let you know too that it's not just teacher discussions and opinions. There's also quantitative data where you have to have different data points to say, okay, well, they've been growing from this 4.5 week to the next one, and they've got to be responsive, not just once, but several times to move from Tier 3 to Tier 2 to Tier 1. So it's just, there's a lot of data points and statistics too that go into it. It's a lot of discussion. So yeah, you're welcome.
Other comments or questions?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you. I had just a couple of operative questions / comments. The first one is in, this is -16, Section 4, which talks about when the school identifies that a student is having difficulty and what the process is for them providing the parents with notification. It just says schools shall notify the parent. Would it be wise to say notify in writing? And one of the things that I'll point to and kind of supporting that comment is in Section 6, the parent's own notification to the school system is required in writing. And it just seems like this is the kind of thing where the more paper trail there is, the better.
Right.
It doesn't guarantee that something can't go wrong, but I would ask the team to maybe consider that before second reading. The second comment is, this is in, I guess, also -16. This is the section that talks about, well, it's on page 6, just to make it easy. notwithstanding paragraph 8C, that's the subsection header. I guess two questions. One, as I'm reading this, it essentially says there's three categories of decision makers. There's the principal, there's the teacher, and then there's the parent, call it group. And the majority of those three essentially just determine whether or not this child is going to be retained or not. I guess I would question, it seems like the parents, while they may be notified, while they may have the ability to sort of express their desires, at the end of the day, it seems like the local decision makers are going to be in a position to overrule the parents in every instance. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that. And then secondly, as a subset to that, the parent group, we may want to add some clarification, because if we have two parents who may not agree on whether the child should or should not be retained, I would hate for the local decision makers to find themselves in a quandary of trying to figure out, well, is the parent group for this or are they against it when there's dissension? So perhaps a mechanism that would break the tie, if you will.
To your first point around parent notification, within the RTI-2 framework, there's notification that goes home to families whenever a child enters into the intervention, is going to receive an intervention. So that could be at any point during the year. There's also a parent notification that goes out when a child moves among the tiers, so moving from tier 2 to tier 3. And additionally, every 4.5 weeks, those data teams get together and they talk about the student and the student's data in the moment and the student's needs and make decisions based on that real-time data. So there's also parent notifications that go home around, are they responding to the intervention? So they're within, it's not called out here, but it's called out within the response to intervention framework. Those are practices that happen. And parent notification is every 4.5 weeks to 9 weeks. So every 4.5 weeks, there's notification. Additionally, there's layers of notification in the Tennessee Literacy Success Act that requires parents to be notified after each universal reading screener window, which is 3 times a year, if their student is at risk of a reading deficiency or is demonstrating a significant reading deficiency. So most districts put all of that information in one letter, but in the majority of the times, a student that is receiving tiered intervention, the parent is going to get at least 4.5 weeks to 9 weeks cadence notification of what intervention they're receiving, how they're doing in the intervention, and then if they need to make changes in the intervention. So there's a lot of parent notification throughout the RTI process that's not specifically called out here.
Okay, thank you. I guess I don't want to take our time today to dig into those details because there's, I'm sure, a lot there. I guess the question and maybe the ask of our team our board staff team would be, can we positively answer this question? Are we certain that the parents will receive some form of written notification prior to something like this occurring, where the student, the administrators want to retain someone, or that child needs to be retained, and the parents should in fact be notified? Are we certain that they will be notified in writing at some point along that process?
Yes.
So I'll leave that there on that item. And then as to the other item, can you just help me understand the dynamic that you're trying to account for, where the local decision makers can overrule the parents' wishes, and how you might anticipate that would play out well or not well?
That is, I mean, this rule is in response to the law, and it's called out in the law that at least these parties have to be there. So it is a 2 to 3 if those are there. So I'm not sure the answer to that, other than we are being responsive to the law. So we could seek some more information there. I think to your other point around mom and dad don't agree, most schools already have a process in place for that, because I'm sure they don't agree around a lot of other things. And so at a local level, they often have local board policies to address that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll do my homework between now and second reading, and I appreciate your time today.
Absolutely.
Good comments. Other comments or questions? Let me just say that I think this continues to be a very healthy discussion, one that has gone on for some time. I think we have made significant progress, but we also want to continue to encourage districts in the K through 2 to get those interventions and those tutoring started early, so it doesn't get down to the 3rd and 4th and 5th grades. So,
absolutely.
We have a Ms. Johnson.
Quick question or clarification. And I agree that everything needs to be done between K and 2nd grade if possible. But am I correct in stating that the reason why they put the 3rd grade as being where you have to do something is because that's where they have an accredited testing?
That's
okay.
The first year we have a summative assessment for all students.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions or comments? So we have a recommendation for academic and instructional requirements promotion and retention rule 052001-03.16 on first reading. Several things to look at between first and second reading. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item, academic and instructional requirements, universal student screeners and state adopted benchmark assessments rule 052001-03.15. Dr. Christy Wall.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, Board. Christy Wall, Assistant Commissioner of Academics and Instructional Strategy from the department, here on first reading to present to you the academic and instructional requirements regarding Rule 0520-01-03.15. The Universal Student Screeners and State Adopted Benchmark Assessments Rule 0520-01-03.15 outlines requirements for local education agencies and public charter schools to annually administer approved universal reading screeners to K-3 students in accordance with the Tennessee Literacy Success Act, TCA 49-1-901. The rule also effectuates requirements of the Tennessee Learning Loss, Remediation and Student Acceleration Act, TCA 49-6-1501, regarding the use of benchmark assessments to identify priority students for summer programming and pre- and post-test requirements. Public Chapter 639 of the Public Acts of 2024, PC 639, amended the Tennessee Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act to remove the requirement that LEAs in public charter schools administer a pre-test in summer camps, after-school mini camps, and learning loss bridge camps. As such, this item updates the rule to remove the reference of the pre-test to align with PC 639. State Board staff will hold a rulemaking hearing between first and final readings to collect public feedback. And I'm happy to take questions or comments on this item.
Thank you, Dr. Wall. We have a recommendation for academic and instructional requirements, universal student screeners, and state adopted benchmark assessments rule 052001-03.15. Is there a motion to accept this? Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second? Second. Mr. Jensen seconds. Questions? No questions. All in favor on first reading, academic and instructional requirements, universal student screeners, and state adopted benchmark assessments rule, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Dr. Wall.
Thank you.
Next item, residential mental health facilities rule 052001-20.02 through 05. Mr. Scott Indermule.
There we go. Good morning, Mr. Chair and board members. My name is Scott Indermill. I'm Senior Director of IDEA and Non-Traditional Education Programs in the Division of Federal Programs and Oversight. State Board of Education Residential Mental Health Facilities Rule 0520-01-20-.02 through .05 outline the requirements for the admission of Tennessee public school students to out-of-state residential mental health facilities in compliance with TCA 49-3-370. TCA 49-3-370B requires local education agencies to allocate state and local funding to out-of-state residential mental health facilities when certain conditions are met. Public Chapter 884 of the 113th General Assembly, enacted in 2024 legislative session, made the following changes to the conditions for admission set forth in TCA 49.370. First, remove the condition that residential mental health facility serves at least 15 students per school year. Second, remove the condition that the student has an active individualized education program at the time that the student is placed in the facility. Three, remove the condition that the student be enrolled in and have attended a Tennessee public school for the full school year immediately preceding the student's placement at the facility, and instead requires the student to be enrolled in and attending a Tennessee public school at the time of the student's admission to the facility. Public Chapter 884 also added a requirement that students' parents be residents of Tennessee at the time the student is placed in the facility. The State Board approved an emergency rule of these revisions on July 15th of this year, special called meeting. This item seeks approval of these revisions as a permanent rule. State Board staff will hold a rulemaking hearing between first and second reading for public feedback. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on first reading. The State Board of Ed staff concurs with the recommendation. I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for residential mental health facilities rules 05200120.02 through 05. Is there a motion to accept this recommendation?
So moved, and I have a comment.
Mr. Mullenhour moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. McInturf seconds. Mr. Mullenhour, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have an operative question under section or dash 04. As I read it, the current language, and I believe this came up maybe in a workshop conversation some number of months ago. I think this creates a scenario in which if a student lives in, let's say, Memphis, to use Larry's example from earlier, under this language, if there's one spot open in Memphis City, in other words, on the completely other side of the state, a student in Memphis would not be able to go 15 minutes down the road into Mississippi, for example, and get the care that they need closer to home, closer to the people that they know, et cetera, et cetera. Am I missing something? Am I misunderstanding something, that this test of, hey, you can't, we're not going to support a student going to an out-of-state facility unless there's exactly zero options for them anywhere within the state of Tennessee. Is that, in fact, the test that's intended here?
So that piece to this rule is in statute. So that is something that we just have incorporated into the rules for clarity in statute. When it comes to students that are placed and they're going through this process for approval, that is something that we have to receive that evidence and assurance through the facility, working with the student and the written doctor's order, physician's order, to ensure that there weren't any beds available in the state.
So just to clarify, is there latitude within the construct of the way that the statute currently exists to, for example, instead of saying there's no available option anywhere in the state, to saying there's no available option within a 50-mile radius or something else practical? Here's my concern. We're going to have families who need help, and the only help that they can get is to send their children potentially hundreds of miles away to some other facility in the state of Tennessee, but yet completely now disconnected from the people that they've known and grown up with and hopefully will care and love them. Is that really a separation that we want to institute?
It's a possibility. Again, these aren't IEP team decisions. These are just individualized decisions made by the family and the physician. So we don't have a seat at the table, nor does the LEA have a seat at the table for where the student's going to be served.
Correct, but the funding is not available unless it passes this test, correct?
That is correct, for out-of-state and in-state as well.
Right, so I'm trying to understand, if we want to help a family that needs help, yes, they could pay for it themselves and send their child to wherever they want, but in the event that they can't afford that, do we really want to require that they have to show us that there's no other option anywhere in the state in order to get that help? It just seems impractical to me.
Yeah, and again, I could defer to our general counsel. I mean, we're just reflecting what's in statute for what we have to require as a condition for any possible allocation.
Okay, so what I'm hearing for you then translated is there's zero wiggle room for us today to say, hey, as long as there's no facility within 50 miles, then, okay, you can't have the funding. We don't have the latitude to tweak it at all in that way. Is that correct?
I will, again, defer to general counsel.
Christy Ballard, General Counsel for the department. I do believe this language reflects the exact language of the statute. We can certainly have more discussion with your counsel, but I do believe right now there's not a lot of wiggle room within the law.
Okay, then I would just propose that we flag this item, and again, I'll do my homework and be prepared when we come back, but I want to make sure that we're not inadvertently creating situations where, some child's going to be, deeply impacted because the funding's not available and nobody else can pay for it. So that was the first question. The second question is, if a spot later opens up in the state, how does this statute, in other words, because this is just kind of this is approaching the question as sort of a, hey, if there's not a spot available right now when we're going to put them in, then here's the path we go down. But what if a spot later opens up? Does that create a conflict either with any of the language that we have here or some other rule?
The only thing that I could communicate regarding if a spot would open up in-state for a bed for a student to receive the help they needed. Again, those would be conversations that are happening outside of our purview and outside of the LEA's purview, because these are independent, like physician to family communications happening. So we would continue to track the number of days that a student would qualify to meet these conditions out of state. If they were to move in-state, then their coding would change from K out to K in, and then we would have to follow those in-state requirements for any type of transfer of allocations.
Got it, thank you. And I'll ask this one question. If you don't know the answer, it's totally fine. Is there a lobbyist or is there a lobby group representing the healthcare facilities that we're talking about here in Tennessee
yes.
that has been a part of this conversation?
Yes.
I would like to hear from that person.
We can get the, we can talk internally. I believe the individual who was leading this charge passed away last year, but we can certainly get you the names and contacts and work with them.
Okay, I'll be super candid. This strikes me as a protectionist mechanism to protect the Tennessee facilities that want to provide these kids with services. And I'm concerned that to the extent that there's a lobbyist involved who's representing them, that they may not be putting those kids' best interests in at top of mind.
Yes, and we'll have those discussions. I'll get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muller. I have one question. When a student goes to an out-of-state facility, who pays for that? Is it the district or who?
It depends. If it were an IEP team decision for the student that's a student in Tennessee, there would be some of that cost for the LEA to incur those costs for the IEP team decision. Typically, these could be students under state custody in DCS, in which there's a contract that DCS may have with the out-of-state facility. It could be a private placement through independent insurance, through a parent, which that would be covered as well. And again, these students do stay enrolled in Tennessee. They're just coded, so we know that they're in-state or out-of-state. In terms of funding, the TISA funds don't apply, but that daily average state rate would be the transfer rate depending on the number of days the student was down there.
Obviously, though, that daily average rate would not pay for the full care for residential.
Not for the full.
The reason I asked the question is, so I'm a district LEA, and the way the rule is now being changed, a student moves in today and is immediately needs to go to an out-of-state facility. So I'm an LEA. I may be then hit with a pretty significant cost that I had not planned on to send a student out. Is that a possibility?
It is possible, depending on the number of days and depending on, I know the daily rates vary a little bit, but I can defer to our CFO, but the funds that are provided for the LEAs are based on to educate the students this year, regardless if the funds were generated the year before.
The way the law was written before, the student would have to have been there for a time, so at least the district could have planned for that in their next year's budget, but right now it's possible that the districts might not.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it would be an internal workaround that they would have to do within each LEA. In terms of some data, I know when I presented the workshop a couple years ago and have been back a few times, we've only had 2 facilities even be approved, and that was last year. There were students that were submitted for possible approval, but to this date, we've had $0 transfer out of Tennessee LEAs to any out-of-state facilities.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Jensen.
There we go. Thank you. Technical difficulties. I want to underscore what's being discussed here, and just footnote, there's some questions that I think need to be answered. I know we've got this law, statute that's been passed, but one of the things that concerns me a bit, I think you read it, and the way I read it, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, is that I could be living in Kentucky or Mississippi or Georgia or wherever. I could move across the state line, and that's not clear. I get a light, gas, and water address, and I can then send my child back to Kentucky or Georgia or wherever for care in that facility. You're removing, and correct me please if I'm wrong, that you're removing this requirement to be in the state for some period of time, and I think the other thing we must recognize that these are children and families that are in crisis. That would be my assumption if they're going to this type of facility. But on the other hand, it just something doesn't feel right to me about that. And again, my question is, if I'm living in Kentucky or Georgia, I've got a child, I can go across the state border, get an apartment, and then my child's that I'm from Kentucky, then my child's able to go back to the Kentucky facility. Am I totally wrong on that?
So the revisions that we're presenting today are based on changes that were made to statute. So we're just aligning our state board rules to statute. So they weren't decisions that we're making at the Department of Education. We're just aligning our state board rules to statute. Just to kind of walk back through the enrollment piece, based on statute, as long as that parent has established residency in Tennessee and that student is enrolled, and that could be same-day enrollment, that would be one of the conditions that could be met for that student or for that facility to receive those in-state LEA funds.
We understand, we have to follow the law, and we understand that's what you're doing here. We're just trying to, I think, raise some of the unintended consequences to get people thinking about that in the future. Other comments or questions? We have a recommendation on first reading then for residential mental health facilities 0420-0120.02 through 05. On first reading, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Next item is middle grades policy. Ms. Deborah Knoll.
Good morning, Chairman Eby and State Board members. I am Deborah Knoll, Assistant Commissioner of College, Career, and Technical Education at the Tennessee Department of Education. I'm pleased to be here today to present to you on the Middle Grades Policy 2.102. Tennessee State Board of Education Middle Grades Policy 2.102 outlines the requirements and expectations for students in grades 5 through 8. Chapter 979 of Public Acts of 2022 expanded access to computer science education to ensure that elementary, middle, and high school students are prepared for evolving workforce needs. In addition to requiring computer science coursework, the department provided professional development and a new computer science endorsement pathway for educators. The PC 979 requires, starting in the 24-25 school year, that middle school students take at least one course of computer science education that includes instruction for at least one grading period during that one full year of their middle school career. Chapter 693 of the Public Acts of 2024 amended that law to clarify that the middle school computer science course requirement applies to students who enroll in the lowest grade level offered at the middle school, starting in the 24-25 school year, or any subsequent school year. This item revises the middle school grades policy 2-102 to add this language requirement so that the policy now aligns with the law. The Department of Education recommends acceptance on this item on first reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation. I'm happy to take any questions.
We have recommendations for middle grade policy 2102. Is there a motion to accept this as provided? Ms. Johnson moves, Mr. Jensen seconds. Questions for Ms. Knoll? No questions. All in favor for accepting the middle grades policy 2102 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, career and technical education course standards. Ms. Knoll.
Great. Good morning again. Again, I'm Deborah Knoll, Assistant Commissioner of College, Career, and Technical Education at the Department of Education. Again, I am pleased to be here today to present to you on the changes and additions to the Career and Technical Education course standards. TCA authorizes the State Board of Education to set policies governing all academic standards and courses to study in the public schools. Additionally, the State Board rule calls for the State Board to adopt standards for each subject area, grades K through 12, and the Standards Review Policy 3.209 requires the Department of Education to review the CTE core standards at a minimum of every 3 years. The approved standards are the basis for planning and instruction programs in each local school system. This item includes revised core standards for all 16 career clusters, CTE elective courses, and middle school CTE courses, as well as new courses within the following career clusters: for agriculture, food and natural resources, human services, and information technology. The department previously reviewed CTE courses on a 3-year cycle. However, beginning in 2023-24 and moving forward, we intend to review each course annually to ensure that the courses are up to date and align with post-secondary and workforce. Reviewing courses may not necessitate changes each year. Districts will receive prior notices of any course changes during the CTE director meetings so that they may plan for any course changes and corresponding implications such as staffing, curriculum, etc. The high school CTE courses have been updated based on educator feedback to align more closely with industry and post-secondary needs. Industry partners and secondary and post-secondary educators have reviewed these new and revised standards. All career clusters listed above have proposed standards to include the importance of utilizing the engineering design process while working with the team to complete a project, the importance of the integration of career and technical student organizations, and the emphasis and growing need for data analysis. We have included a summary on the cover sheet of the revisions for each career cluster, along with the outline of changes for each course standard, and finally provided a list of advisory council members for each career cluster who are part of the standards revision or vetting process. As just mentioned, this year we made significant strides in embedding STEM content across all of our courses, ensuring that students not only engage with key strategies essential for post-secondary education and career success, such as collaboration, critical thinking, and problem solving, but also have aligned opportunities to connect directly with industry through these experiences. These changes are aligned to our revised Perkins 5 state plan. In addition to submitting data science standards as a standalone program of study, we are also prioritizing exposing all students to the rigorous foundational standards in data science across every career cluster. We recognize that the skills and knowledge gained from these standards are universally applicable across industries, complementing the technical skills students will acquire. This past year marked both a reset in our approach as well as an intentional alignment to our revised Perkins 5 state plan that went into effect July 1. Our office focused on ensuring that our standards are of highest quality, with meticulous attention to both content and formatting, as well as adhering to recent approved legislation. Our educators and students are held to high expectations daily, and we felt that it was imperative that our team both model and exceed these standards as exemplars of excellence. We will provide professional development to our educators to help prepare for these changes. Specific professional development around STEM and data science will be provided, as well as career cluster specific professional development will be offered to address specific career cluster standard changes. Looking forward, we will continue to rigorously evaluate our standards annually to ensure they remain relevant and cutting edge, keeping pace with the rapid advancements in innovation and technology. While this year involved a substantial revisions, I anticipate a more streamlined process in the future. The Department of Education recommends acceptance of this item on first reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation. I really appreciate your patience and dedication in reviewing our large number of submissions. If you have any questions, I am happy to address them at this time.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for, on first reading, career and technical education course standards. Is a motion to accept this recommendation? Mr. Wells moves, Mr. Jensen seconds. Are there comments or questions? Mr. Jensen.
You may be surprised that I have a comment.
No.
Thank you for what you've done and your team. This is a labor that you have led for a number of years, and the outcomes of it are becoming more and more evident, and I just want to express my thanks for that. I do want to ask how you are getting to industry standards. The first part of that is a general question. The second part is there, we had the Department of Labor here yesterday, and we got THEC here. Is there a place where those groups are coming into the room and having depth of discussion? And I think of, in particular, the Oak Ridge nuclear, what's going to happen there? What are we doing as educators to make sure that happens? I think you think about what happened in Memphis with XAI coming in there. It's 340 jobs, and they're not paying minimum wage, by the way. And Elon Musk is investing a ton of money. And are we out there ahead of this asking folks like that, what do you need, what do you need, what do you need? And then are we coming back, and it's not just THEC or the Department of Education or the Department of Labor, but there's some way that this is being really vetted together so that we're very, very responsive to these. Because generally, if we do a good job on the nuclear piece or the AI piece, there are going to be more jobs to come, and they're going to come fast. And it seems to me it's mission critical that we really are working together. And in some ways, as fast as this stuff is moving, that we can't be slow. Yeah. We got to move fast. And so my question is if you look at industry partners, you look at TCATS, you look at Department of Labor, you look at the Department of Education, how are we collaborating to make sure that we're not waiting, but we're aggressively in communication and hopefully even maybe ahead of those industries? And does that make sense what I'm asking?
Absolutely. No, that's great question, so thank you for that. So to answer this kind of in multiple parts, the first and foremost, we have state advisory councils for each career cluster. So advanced manufacturing has one, IT has one, every career cluster has their own advisory council that we vet every 3 years. On these advisory councils are secondary teachers, post-secondary, and industry folks. So we bring together those advisory councils 2 or 3 times a year to have these conversations around our standards, ensuring that we are providing what is the most rigorous and most relevant for our students. That is also why we're intentionally looking at these now every year. To your point, everything changes so quickly. Along with these advisory councils, we're very much having great conversations across state agencies. So we're very connected to the Department of Labor. We're very connected to ECD. At the end of the month, we have a cross-state agency conversation around nuclear energy, to your point, to see, where do we fit into this? We are also having conversations with Advanced CTE, which is a national organization who outlines the 16 career clusters. We are currently going to go through a revision down to 13 career clusters, but one pieces of that revision is an energy cluster that will come out of that. So we are engaging in conversations with Oak Ridge, with TVA. We'll be engaging about this conversation about nuclear energy as we develop this energy cluster in the near future as well.
If I may suggest something that we have in our economic development in Memphis, we have what's called a one-stop shop. So somebody comes in and everybody's in the room. The power, light folks, the zoning, everybody's in the room. And I just think maybe, as we're recruiting industry, just as a suggestion to explore perhaps, is that you have a one-stop shop for education that would bring in all of those folks. It may be too much to accomplish, but it just seems like I'm representing an industry coming in here, and I've got jobs. I've got a lot of jobs that they're bringing that I could be able to say, hey, look, let me bring the educational folks into the room from all of the T's, and that they would be able to say, okay, here's what we got. How can you help us? Just a suggestion.
No, great point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think one thing is we end up in silos is we have education. We even have K through 12 education. We have higher ed. We have industry. I'm looking back here and I see Patrick Sheehy, who represents the Tennessee Business Roundtable. I don't know if that's where it ought to be or something, but we need a state call to bring all these organizations together, bring education and industry together to meet the needs for the state to continue to grow the way it is. Because if we're not preparing our students for post-secondary success, for these jobs, whether CTE jobs or whatever, then the state can't grow. So we need something, some organization that brings all of us together toward this one end.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you. We have a motion on the table for our career and technical education course standards. And a second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item is state-approved textbooks. Ms. Lee Houston.
Good morning. I'm Lee Houston. I'm the Executive Director of the Textbook Commission, and I have our attorney, newly obtained attorney, and we're excited to have Hayden Shadden with us. We are presenting materials for the science edition, and the background is the State Textbook and Instructional Materials Quality Commission has prepared a preliminary of textbooks and instructional resources for Section D, which is science. That is TSA 49-1-302A9. States that it is the duty of the State Board of Education, and the State Board has power to prescribe the use of textbooks and other instructional materials based on recommendations of the State Textbook and Instructional Materials Quality Commission for the various subjects taught or used in construction with public schools. TSA 49-6-2202A requires the State Textbook and Instructional Materials Quality Commission to prepare a list of standard editions of textbooks and instructional materials for approval by the State of Education for the use in public schools of the state. The law also provides that the Commission, through its chair, may appoint an advisory panel of expert teachers and other experts in each subject area or grade level to advise the Commission on textbooks and instructional materials selection, TSA 49-6-2201N1A. The chair of the Commission led the advisory panel application review between October 2023 and March 2024. During the March meeting, the Commission accepted applications to fill an advisory panel consisting of science educators. Their applications were scored by both the Commission and the subject matter experts at the department. They also approved the scoring rubric for materials focusing on 3 categories. First, the publishers had to provide Tennessee standards alignment, guides, second, materials to cover 100% of the state standards to align with Chapter 990 of the Public Acts of 2022, and third, materials had to meet 80% of the quality indicators outlined by the Commission. The panelists conducted independent reviews between April 26 and June 28, 2024. The reports were disseminated to the Commission members during the July 30th, 2024 meeting. The Commission will meet on October 2nd, 2024, and hear publishers' appeals to the panel reviews and consider any public comment, either written or verbal, at that time. The Commission will vote on the final items of the list and determine which textbooks and instructional materials to recommend to the State Board for final approval at the November State BOE meeting. This item presents the initial list of state textbooks recommended by the Commission on first reading. This item supports the State Board's strategic focus on literary, post-secondary, career teachers, leaders' engagements, and accountability outlined in the master plan by providing science materials for grades K-12. All policies were followed and materials aligned with the standards set forth by the State of Tennessee Department of Education and the law of the state. TSA 49-1212 requires that the department prepare a fiscal analysis of any policy, rule, or regulation proposed to the State Board of Education. This item has no financial impact on an ELA. and the recommendation is that the State Textbook and Instructional Materials Commission recommends approval on this item's on first reading, and that the SBA staff concurs with this recommendation. And you have a list of textbooks that passed on first appeal, and the shaded ones are the ones that have the opportunity to appeal at our next commission meeting on October 2nd.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for state-approved textbook, Section D, Science. Is there a motion to accept this recommendation? Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second? Ms. Maxwell? Okay, second. Is there questions or discussion? I have a couple of questions. So I went through your list, and in the K through 5, there's only one approved. Studies Weekly appears to be the only publisher that passed in K through 5. So what happens? I know the others have a chance to appeal. What happens if only one passes? Everybody has that one textbook, and that's the only option they have?
That with the standards that you set forth, with 100% of the standards being there and then the 80% of the rubrics being met, if they don't meet those, then again, it would fail. They know what the rubrics are. There is a pivot in how research says that the science technology should be approached, and the publishers are lagging behind in this. And that's a problem that we see nationwide. And I think that as that progresses and they see that the parts that they failed on, and they can correct those, that the ones that are serious will. Some missed it by just a little, others missed the mark by a lot. And so I think that when they see that we will have some more choices. And if not, if a district says that they want something else, they always have that choice to come back to you and say, can we use an alternative text? But right now, I don't think as a commission that it should pass if it doesn't meet those standards that we set forth.
So that's the reason they failed, is that they did not meet the
They did not meet the standards.
Okay. Other questions? I want to thank the Textbook Commission. And I mean, it's a lot of work that y'all go through and quite an effort, and we appreciate it very much. It's a very important activity, obviously, for our students, and so thank you for that.
Thank you.
We have a motion then for state-approved textbooks, Section D, Science, on first reading. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item, Charter Schools Rule 05201401.0103 through 05. Ms. Allie Reed.
Good morning. Allie Reed, Director of Engagement and Accountability for the State Board. This item proposes several changes to our charter schools rules in response to recent legislation from the 2024 session. Firstly, Public Chapter 1066 established the Opportunity Charter School, which can serve at-risk students in grades 6 through 12. And to align with this law, State Board rule has been updated to define an Opportunity Charter School, to further define the at-risk enrollment preferences that are set forth in law, to define the types of documentation that a charter school can collect to verify a student is at risk, and to set requirements for charter school authorizers to evaluate an Opportunity Charter School's enrollment of at-risk students. Additional proposed changes to this rule includes the removal of our BEP funding language now that schools are funded through TISA, and to align with Public Chapter 923, which updates reporting requirements for LEAs with underutilized and vacant properties. Our team collaborated with the Department of Education, the Charter Commission, the Charter Center, and charter school authorizers. And we also consulted with the Department of Children's Services to better understand the types of documentation that may be obtained when verifying at-risk students. Our team will seek another round of feedback between first and final reading through a rulemaking hearing, and happy to answer any questions.
We have a recommendation for Charter School Rules 0520140101 and 03205. Is there a motion to accept?
So moved.
Mr. Molinaro moves.
Second.
Mr. Holt seconds. Let me just, for our new members, we get a motion to get it on the table for discussion. So that doesn't mean necessarily we're going to pass it or whatever, but we can't, until we have a motion in a second, we really can't bring it up on the table. So that's the process that we go through. So we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? I have a couple of questions. First, let me ask this. The law requires several changes beyond our rule that fall under the department's purview. Is there somebody here who can answer some questions that we have? Let's see with that. Mr. Jack Powers. Good.
Thank you, Chairman. Jack Powers with the Department of Education. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Powers. First question I had is, the law allows opportunity charter schools to begin operating in 2026-2027 school year. When would an applicant need to apply to be operational by that time?
That's a great question. So the letter of intent to apply would be due December 1st of this year, so December 1st, 2024, and then the application would be due in February of 2025.
Okay. And have there been changes to the charter application to include questions for these applicants?
That's another great question. So we're in the process of making some modifications to the application and any subsequent materials there to accommodate the new potential opportunity charter school option.
So you expect to have those done within a time frame that they can respond by the 1st of December?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. Other questions? Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Powers, how is the department currently thinking about the accountability framework for opportunity charter schools?
Another great question. So when we look at accountability, we've kind of got three buckets that we have to consider, right? We've got our federal accountability model, we have our A through F letter grade system, and we have the performance frameworks, the model performance framework that's also called out in the legislation. If you look at any of the research on these opportunity charter schools, some publications, the National Alliance for Public Charter School, for example, that has a really great meta-analysis on these, they call them alternative education campuses, but all of the research around accountability is trying to answer the question of what are the appropriate modifications to make, given the fact that these schools are really going to serve a pretty unique population of our kiddos. And what that means is that some of the really common accountability indicators that you all may be used to, some things related to chronic absenteeism, right, achievement versus growth, are things we really need to consider, given that these are schools that are going to serve 75% of at-risk kids. So that is what the department is thinking of right now. Our intent is to kind of provide a holistic look at all three of those elements that I mentioned. So the accountability on the federal side, potential appropriate modifications to our A through F letter grade system, and then finally modifying the performance framework. But we want to make sure that we get all of that right. You'll notice in the legislation, too, that we're required to pull together a working group to kind of weigh in on this. So one of the most concrete kind of next steps that we're going to take is call together stakeholders. We would welcome the opportunity to potentially have a member of the state board or their staff on this stakeholder group to answer that question. What are the appropriate modifications we need to make to those three buckets to accommodate these schools?
And what's the timeline that you anticipate for rolling that out? And then also, is that going to be in rule or guidance, or what's that going to look like at the end of the day?
So the timeline is pretty soon, right? Like, I think what our intent is to have a lot of the accountability questions pretty clear by the time that the letter of intent would be due, but certainly by the time that the application is due, so that these charter management organizations who may want to come and open these schools have a pretty clear understanding of what their accountability expectations are. So I would say within the next, month or so, we're hoping to call together this group and start providing them some questions and reflections to engage on.
Is that going to be in guidance, or what's the ultimate work product? What do you?
So I think we're going to, you'll notice in the law too that the state board has to, I believe the term is adopt the accountability framework. So that would be our proposal, is we would propose the plan, whether it would be in a policy or rule. I think we would have to talk about. There are certain elements of accountability for traditional public schools that are in the state board's purview when it comes to policy or rule, and then certain ones that are not. But what we know right now is it will be presented as an item to the state board for you all to contemplate. I just don't know if it'll be a rule or a policy yet.
Great, thank you.
Other questions? Mr. Wells?
Just kind of along those lines a little bit. The stakeholders, I know you said maybe us, but who else are you thinking?
So we've had a lot of outreach, actually. We've had a couple of folks who operate charter schools now in the state have reached out and expressed interest. The Tennessee Public Charter School has shared an interest in participating, and then the Speaker's office, who sponsored the legislation, has also shared some names. So we're going to make sure we kind of capture the who's who of charter school and other appropriate folks across the state.
Other questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Oh, Mr. Mullenhour, then Mr. Cobbins.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just in terms of the law requires a performance framework for authorizers that are approving opportunity charter schools and the department to develop that. Is there a timeline for that, or is that in the works?
That's a good question. So what our intent there is probably to have the performance framework. If you look at the performance framework right now, that's a document that's just on the department's website. In the performance framework, we have our model one. If you look at it, what's probably most appropriate is for us to convene the group of stakeholders together to determine the federal and the A through F side, and then for where we land on that to then play into the performance framework, because the performance framework has a lot of the same indicators that our A through F letter grade system does. For example, it has growth, it has achievement, and since that is a document that just lives on our website and that we can kind of update, that's probably the cadence, is that it'll follow after. And just as a reminder, that performance framework is it's just a model. So when districts and charter operators enter into an agreement to open a school, they can choose that model or they can choose one of their own.
Mr. Mullenhour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not quite sure which of you to direct this question at. This is concerning 052B7. This is the part that talks about the reporting of vacant and underutilized properties. My high-level question is, and I didn't see it in this body of law, so I think it must be found somewhere else, but my understanding is that in the event that we have a district that has vacant buildings and a charter school wants to move into that district, what obligations, if any, does that district have to make those underutilized or vacant properties available to that charter school?
Allie Reed, Director of Engagement and Accountability. The LEA is not required to lease or sell their properties. This law is simply requiring them to just list them and to inform the public of what potentially is available. And so then they could have that conversation with a charter applicant or a current operator who may say, we need extra space. We're interested in this property. Would you be willing to sell it to us or lease some of it out, whatever. It's really just to initiate that conversation. They are not obligated to do anything with it.
So you said under this law, that's not a requirement. Is there another law or statute or rule that requires that property be?
This was just updating what was in there because it was pretty vague as to how we defined underutilized and vacant properties. And so what the law did and what we're reflecting here in rule is to be a little more specific because there was a lot of questions among LEAs as to what and when and how to report.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Holt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions about the language in the rule.
In the same section?
Well, no, in actually section 10A, 1 sub 2, the definition of at-risk students. And so Roman numeral 4 under that, which is retention at least twice. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. As I read the second sentence, acceptable proof of meeting this criteria includes but is not limited to student transcripts or was chronically absent as defined in the ESSA plan. I wasn't sure if there was a missing word or phrase. I looked on both the red line and the clean. The one starting Roman numeral 4, the second sentence.
I see what you're pointing out. I think those are actually supposed to be two separate, and so I'm not sure how that shifted. I will take a look at that. Because chronically absent is a separate category. So being retained more than once is a category on its own, and then chronically absent is an additional one. So I think those should actually be separate. Sorry.
It's just a typo.
Yeah, I think it's just a typo.
Just the addition of the words or chronically absent, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we can work that out in between first and second reading.
Yep. Thank you.
Subsection 5, the one below it, and this is a section as I understand it, so it mirrors the statute in defining the categories for students to be at risk, but then the rule is now defining what sort of documentation is going to be sufficient for the charter school to show that these students, each one of them qualifies as at risk, and they have to have 75% of their students to qualify in order to remain open as an opportunity charter school.
That's correct. At the time of enrollment, yes.
Great. So the one about students being pregnant or being a parent, so we would be requiring a statement from a treating physician that the student is pregnant, or a birth certificate or adoption record. And I wondered if school nurses or something short of a physician might be appropriate, just to kind of broaden the list of what should be credible sources for whether a student is in fact pregnant, knowing this is a population that, you know, may not have access to medical care and things like that to the same extent that some others may. So just
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
occurred to me.
So we did have conversations about that and several other similar conversations. And so you'll note that at the very end of that section, it says that there can also be comparable verifying evidence identified in the department's guidance. And so we're just listing a few to start, and then expect that the department will continue to add on, because we certainly don't want to inadvertently not include some students because of a type of documentation. We don't want this to be limiting.
Great. And then the last question I had was about, so 2 down from that, subsection 7. The student has experienced circumstances of abuse or neglect. And the proof is either a court order of an open or, I guess, an open abuse or neglect case, or previously the subject of an abuse or neglect case, or documentation demonstrating the student is the subject of a screened-in report. And I just am not familiar with what a screened-in report is or does. But my concern on that was the language of the statute, of the law, was, I read it as pretty broad, and there are other places where it said, you know, you need to show documented substance abuse, and here it's just saying circumstances of abuse or neglect. And so to require a court order, you know, I'm sure there are lots of circumstances of abuse and neglect where you don't have a court order, and I just don't know what a screened-in report is. So I just want us to be thoughtful about, are we actually going to be identifying, you know, obviously we need to have like reliable documentation and criteria. We can't just have somebody show up and say that, you know, I am this one, I raised my hand for it. But is this category really, the documentation we're requiring really broad enough to capture the group?
Yep. This is probably one that we spent the most amount of time discussing, because how do we define that? And the screened-in report is language that we got from the Department of Children's Services that did say that that's not limited to how it would be described in other states, because we also talked about, if you're coming from out of state, what does that look like? So that's common language in their world. But this is one that we are going to continue to have conversations with the Department of Children's Services now that we have this language drafted, go back to them, because they wanted to do some additional research on their end to see, is that something we can actually provide? And the idea behind that report is that it's an inquiry. So a court order is taking it much further, right, to your point, but the screened-in report is there was some type of inquiry done or some type of indication that was made for them to do some like researching into it. And so that's my understanding of that type of report. And again, that language comes from them, but is one that we want to continue to tweak between first and final to really get clear on, like, is that something that is common, and can we actually receive that documentation?
Great. That sounds good. And I'd love to be a part of those conversations between first and final.
Sure.
Because, you know, I'm sure the General Assembly wants to make this available to all the people who qualify, and it's a challenge to figure out how do we identify those people, and I can see that category in particular being difficult. So, but thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. McInturf.
So you all were talking about coming up with a modification for the accountability for this charter school. Would that possibly open up discussions for schools that are in traditional settings for modifications if they have a higher risk of at-risk students?
So that's a really good question. I'll just answer kind of directly that there is no plan to do a subsequent evaluation right now for traditional public schools.
Okay.
I think when we first saw this piece of legislation and we looked at the definition for at-risk, we internally had pretty good discussion on, is that going to get close to defining some of our traditional public schools? And I personally feel confident. I mean, it's hard because of, to your point, some of these things are hard to monitor and have definitive evidence on. it's hard to just look across the state right now amongst our traditional public schools and say they do or do not meet this definition. I personally feel like this would be a much higher percentage of student in this category than you would find in any traditional public school. And so for that reason, and again, drawing back to some of the research and some of the white papers that you can see on this topic, they do call out the need to modify the accountability framework because of how markedly different this population of student will be.
Mr. Jensen.
I'm curious, what would the student population look like in terms of numbers across the state potentially? I think it's a wonderful idea to do what we're doing, but I think it's sort of to your question. I think what I heard you saying was, what about kids that are in public school settings that don't necessarily need to? It just seems like the numbers. I've followed the chronic absenteeism and truancy in some of the in Memphis public schools, and it's 25. They say it's 28%, but if you look at middle school, it's much higher there. And then I think even in the rural West Tennessee, there are districts that have 25% chronic absenteeism, and that's not necessarily the way you identify it, but that's indicative of one of the parts of this solution that's being proposed. So I think it's a great idea to think about this, but what kind of numbers, and you may not have an answer now, I would like to know kind of an estimate of what that might look like across the state, of how many children we need to be thinking about for this kind of, which I think is a great idea. So I'm not diminishing the idea. I guess I'm concerned that we've got, what are those numbers? And we're going to do 1 or 2 or 3, and that's going to be nice, but it's not going to be enough.
That's a great question. I can offer just some data points that might help you. And again, I would call to the report from the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools is one of the main ones. There are somewhere around 35 or 38 states that have kind of a similar model. And again, the terminology used to describe these varies a lot. But what I would say is I think we're probably not going to see thousands and thousands of students enroll in these types of schools. I mean, one of the reasons is the Tennessee-specific context when it comes to charter schools, right? I think right now we have, I want to say when you count Rutherford County, we'll now have 7 entities that have authorized charter schools. So we don't have charter schools in all of our counties and districts, and I think just that fact alone will maybe limit how many of these schools that we see initially. But it's certainly a good question, and we're interested to see exactly how many exist as well.
If I may add on to that, I will also note that one of the at-risk categories is not having graduated from the high school, and so while it's open to 6 through 12, it's not age restriction, so we could see adults coming back and opportunities for adults to come back, and I know that's something that's a passion of yours, Mr. Jensen, so I think we'll be really interested to see the numbers, but there is quite an opportunity here for some adult learners too.
Very good discussion. I think it just shows our responsibility in the state board having oversight for the charter schools. So good discussion. We have a recommendation on charter school rules 0520, 14, 01, 01, and 03 through 05. All in favor on first reading signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. That finishes our items on first reading. Before we go to final reading, why don't we reconvene, take a break? We reconvene at 11:30. 1 minute, 1 minute. Let's reconvene. We'll now move on to action items, final reading. First item, educator licensure, educator license types, endorsements, permits, and requirements for the limited license rules 0520, 02, 03, 02, and 11 through 13. Ms. Taylor Reed.
Good morning. Taylor Reed, Senior Director of Educator Licensure. Tennessee State Board of Education Educator Licensure Rule 05200203 outlines the license types issued in Tennessee and pathways towards licensure. Sections .02 govern various license types and the validity period. Section .11 governs the issuance of endorsement exemptions, waivers. Section .12 governs the issuance of permits, and Section .13 governs the issuance of the limited license. To align with recently passed legislation from the 2024 legislative session, this item proposes the following revisions to the rule. Extends the validity period for professional licenses from no more than 7 years to no more than 11 years in accordance with Public Chapter 1005. Revises the permits rule to allow temporary teaching permits and a limited license for elementary physical education, PE courses, to align with Public Chapter 843, and in accordance with Public Chapter 876, allows temporary teaching permits for courses with an end-of-course EOC exam with an assigned mentor teacher. Lastly, this rule revises Section .11 regarding endorsement exemptions to remove the reference to Public Chapter 932 that authorized endorsement exemptions for courses with an end-of-course exam. This flexibility was only available through the 23-24 school year. State Board staff held a rulemaking hearing on July 25th, 2024. No comments were received. Changes between first and final reading were made to amend degree requirements in the permits rule .12 to reflect national accreditation recognized by the Council for Higher Education Accreditation, CHIA, for permit issuance to align with requirements as outlined by the U.S. DOE. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for educator licensure, educator license types, endorsements, permits, and requirements for the limited license rules. Recommendation for approval and final reading. Is there a motion? Mr. Wells moves. Is there a second? Second. Ms. McInturf seconds. Are there any questions for Ms. Reed? No questions. This is a rule which require a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin, please call the roll.
Mr. Cobbins.
Aye.
Ms. Alberson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion passes. I will note that Mr. Holt did have to leave for the last part of our meeting, and he is excused for the rest of the meeting. Thank you. Motion passes. Thank you, Ms. Reed. Next item is Employment Standard Rules, 0520, 02, 06-01, and 02. Again, Mr. Taylor Reed.
Morning, Taylor Reed, Senior Director of Licensure. Tennessee State Board of Education Employment Standards Rule 05200206 defines the requirements for certain school and district level positions that educators may hold without holding a specific endorsement. This item proposes revisions to section .01 to clarify that employment standards outline the requirements for certain school and district LEA level positions that educators may hold without holding an endorsement. This item also amends section .02 to extend flexibility for individuals to teach Year 1 CTE courses. This employment standard would allow teachers holding a valid Tennessee teacher license with an endorsement through at least grade 8 to teach Year 1 CTE courses. Lastly, this item creates an employment standard to allow any educator holding an active educator license to teach a course with an end-of-course exam if the educator obtains a qualifying score on the applicable assessment aligned to the appropriate endorsement as found in the Professional Assessments for Tennessee Educators Policy 5.105 in accordance with TCA 49-6-6006. State Board staff held a rulemaking hearing on July 25th, 2024. No comments were received. Minor clerical changes were made to the rule between first and final reading to capitalize terms and adjust formatting. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for Employment Standards Rule 0520-02, 06-0.01, and 02. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves for approval. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Jensen seconds. Is there further discussion? No discussion. Again, this is a rule on final reading. Mr. Griffin, please call the roll call.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Alberson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion passes. Next item is Educator Licensure Policy 5.502. Ms. Taylor Reed.
Taylor Reed, Senior Director of Licensure. Tennessee State Board of Education Educator Licensure Policy 5.502 outlines general licensure requirements, including application and duration of licenses, professional development points, and endorsements. This item revises the endorsement section by outlining the requirements for educators to add the dance endorsement, which requires an educator to hold a valid Tennessee educator license and have at least one post-secondary course in dance or be recommended by a state board-approved EPP, Educator Preparation Program, in dance. This item also revises the endorsement section by assigning endorsement codes for recently adopted English as a second language, health and wellness, and physical education endorsements in both the K-8 and 6-12 grade band splits. There have been no changes to this item since first reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation on final reading for Educator Licensure Policy 5.502. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second? Second. Mr. Wells seconds. Are there any questions for Ms. Reed? Any discussion? This is a policy item, so all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item, Occupational Educator Scholarship Program Rules 0520-02-05-.03 through 05. Dr. Jennifer Nelson.
Hello, Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation at the department. Tennessee State Board of Education Occupational Educator Scholarship Program Rule outlines the eligibility requirements, selection criteria, and terms for the Occupational Educator Scholarship Program. This item clarifies that the written agreement is with the state of Tennessee and changes the 4-year requirement to a 3-year requirement to teach and maintain an active and valid occupational teacher license. This revision coincides with the EPP's accreditation requirement of tracking candidates for 3 years. This item also defines timelines signifying repayment and account default and associated consequences. State Board staff held a rulemaking hearing on July 25th, 2024. No comments were received. There have been no changes to this item since first reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation.
Sorry. We have a recommendation for Occupational Educator Scholarship Programs Rule 0520-02-05-.03 through 05. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Mr. Mullenhour moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Ms. McInturf, second. Any discussion? No discussion. This is a rule, requires a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Albertson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf.
Aye.
Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion passes. Next item is Educator Preparation Policy 5.504. Dr. Jennifer Nelson.
Hello, Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation at the state. This item represents the following revisions to the Educator Preparation Policy 5.504. It adds charter management organizations to align with revisions to the Educator Preparation Rule. It adds the Association for Advancing Quality in Educator Preparation, AQUEP, to the provider and program reviews. It adds the department's review of EPP implementation to the foundational literacy skills standards to the annual reports. It requires candidates for admission to an instructional leader preparation program to have successfully completed an ed prep program and hold a valid educator license rather than a valid teaching license. Revises requirements for admission to instructional leadership preparation programs. Revises requirements for clinical practice sites to include category 1, 2, or 3 non-public schools to align with the educator preparation rule, and it deletes the COVID-19 flexibility. There have been no changes to this item since first reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for approval of Education Preparation Policy 5.504. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second? Mr. Wells seconds. Is there any discussion? No discussion. All in favor for approving Educator Preparation Policy 5.504 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, Career and Technical Education Coordination Supervision of Student Work-Based Learning Rule 0520-01-07.04. Ms. Deborah Knoll.
Good morning, Deborah Knoll, Assistant Commissioner of College, Career, and Technical Education at the Tennessee Department of Education. Happy to present on Career and Technical Education Coordination and Supervision of Student Work-Based Learning Experience Rule. Chapter 543 of the Public Acts of 2024, PC 543, increase the maximum number of work-based learning credits that a student may earn in each school year. It amends the law to allow a student to earn up to 6 work-based learning credits each school year and states that a minimum of 5 hours per week of supervised work experience is required for each additional credit. This item presents revisions to the rule to align with PC 543. There have been no changes since this item, since first reading, and State Board staff held a public rulemaking hearing on July 5th, 2024, and no comments were received. The Department of Education recommends approval on this item on final reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation. Happy to take any questions.
We have a recommendation for Career and Technical Education Coordination and Supervision of Student Work-Based Learning Experience Rule 0520-01-07.04. Is there a motion for action? Mr. Jensen moves and Mr. Wells seconds. Is there any further discussion?
I do have one.
Yes,
one question.
Mr. Jensen.
You're now 6. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And is that funding going with that reimbursement for the courses?
So we do have work-based learning course codes
Right.
that are assigned, and those are on there, yes.
But we're getting 6 for a student, and all 6 would be covered if in fact they did that.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes, we've got course codes for each one.
Okay. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to comment, you're really good at this 0104, 0.04.
Rolls off his tongue.
I like
you may
numbers.
You may want to do some auction work on the side.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? We have Career and Technical Education Coordination Supervision of Student Work-Based Learning Experience Rule 0520-01-07.04. This is a rule, requires a roll call vote. Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Iverson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Ms. Jensen. Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion carries. Thank you. Next item is Educator Evaluation Policy 5201. Ms. Brooke Amos.
Good morning, Chairman Eby and members of the board. Brooke Amos, Assistant Commissioner of Human Capital. Pursuant to TCA 49-1-302 and Educator Evaluation Rule 0520-02-01, educators and evaluators are responsible for selecting a closely aligned achievement measure. The Tennessee Department of Education monitors implementation and provides feedback to districts to ensure all measure selections comply with statute and policy. For an assessment to be recommended for state board approval as an achievement measure, the department reviews the measure to ensure it meets key criteria, such as frequency of use, alignment to current content standards, rigor, and the ability to measure the impact of teaching practice. All measures recommended for inclusion and removal are listed on the cover sheet. No changes were made to this item between first and final reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading. SBF staff concur with this recommendation. Happy to take any questions.
We have a recommendation for Educator Evaluation Policy 5201. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Second. Ms. McInturf seconds. Any discussion for Ms. Amos? No discussion. All in favor for Educator Evaluation Policy 5201 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item, repeal mental health standards and guideline policies 4209. Ms. Lori Paisley.
Hello again, Lori Paisley, Assistant Commissioner of Coordinated School Health at Department. The State Board of Education's Mental Health Standards and Guidelines Policy 4.209 provides guidelines on improving student achievement by reducing fragmentation of services and aligning and integrating mental health services to children. This policy has not been updated since 2009, and since then, with the support of the Tennessee General Assembly and Governor Lee, the state has made unprecedented investments in student mental health and well-being. As part of those efforts, new and revised policies and programs have superseded the recommendations listed in this policy. Therefore, this item repeals this policy. The guidelines and recommendations contained in this policy are now included in and fully addressed by other policies and department programs, most significantly the Coordinated School Health Program Policy 4.204, School Counseling Model Standards Policy 5.103, and our Project Aware grant. There have been no changes to this item since first reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading. The State Board staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation to repeal mental health standards and guidelines policies 4209. Is there a motion for action? Mr. Jensen moves. Is there a second? Ms. Johnson seconds. Are there any questions? No questions. All in favor for repealing mental health standards and guidelines policies 4209 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, parent involvement and engagement policy 4207. Ms. Paisley.
Thank you. Again, I'm Lori Paisley, Assistant Commissioner of Coordinated School Health at the department. The State Board of Education's Parent Family Involvement Engagement Policy 4.207 provides minimum standards for the development of parent-family involvement and engagement practices. This policy was last revised in 2015, and since then, the Department of Education has strengthened the support of high-quality parent and family involvement and engagement through the development of a state framework, professional development, communication, and program evaluation. The guidelines and recommendations in this policy are supported by the Coordinated School Health Program Policy 4.204. Previously, this policy also included content about community schools. However, this item proposes to remove that information because community schools are primarily partnerships between a local education agency and its community partners. The community partners can provide a range of services to students, families, and residents. The department and state board support and encourage LEAs to form these partnerships through the work of state coordinated school health teams and the specific coordinated school health component of student, family, and community involvement. Because the community schools partnerships are ultimately between the LEA and the community partners, and because there is not currently state grant funding available, there is not a need for state board policy on this issue, though the department will continue to support implementation. There are no changes between first and final reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading, and the state board staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for Parent Family Involvement Engagement Policy 4207. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Mr. Mullenhour moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Mr. Wells seconds. Mr. Mullenhour, I have a question.
Just a very brief comment. I just wanted to say thank you for your work on this, and also it's encouraging to me to see it so succinctly stated in the purpose section of this document that we recognize the importance of parental involvement in the family unit. I know that there's not everybody and not every state views it that way, and I'm just grateful for the work that you do, and I'm grateful that we have people in this state who recognize the importance of that particular section of this entire policy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mullenhour. I heard a ditto over here too. So, any other comments or questions? All in favor then for approving Parent Family Involvement and Engagement Policy 4207 as written signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Paisley.
Thank you.
Next item, English Language Development Standards. Dr. Jennifer Jordan.
Hello again, Jennifer Jordan, Assistant Commissioner, Special Education and Student Supports. TCA 491302A8 authorizes the State Board to set policies governing all academic standards and courses of study in the public schools. Additionally, State Board Rule 05200103.031 calls for the State Board to adopt standards for each subject area, grades K-12. The approved standards are to be the basis for planning instructional programs in each local school system. The English Language Development Standards were last adopted in 2013 when the state adopted WIDA's Standard Screener and Assessment. In July 2024, the state moved to ELPA 21 for both its English as a second language programming standards and assessment. Therefore, this item proposes to adopt the English Language Proficiency Assessment for the 21st century, or ELPA 21. Standards as Tennessee's English Language Development Standards. The English Language Development Standards are used to help English learners access content in their core classes. They are designed to complement instruction in the Tennessee academic standards for the other subjects while also building students' development in the English language. The department has provided training opportunities for ESL teachers and district staff related to the ELPA 21 standards and assessment transition, and will continue its support plan throughout the summer of 2024 and ongoing. There are no changes on the final reading. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading. The SBE staff concurs with this recommendation.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for approval on English Language Development Standards. Is there a motion for action? Ms. Maxwell moves. Is there a second? Second. Vice Chair Cobbins seconds. Are there any questions for Dr. Jordan? No questions. All in favor then for approving English Language Standards Development signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item, World Language Standards. Dr. Christy Wall.
Thank you, Chairman. Christy Wall, Assistant Commissioner of Academics and Instructional Strategy from the Department, presenting on final reading the recommendation around World Language Standards. TCA 491302A8 authorizes State Board of Education to set policies governing all academic standards and courses of study in public schools. Additionally, State Board Rule 0520-01-03 10.031 calls for the state board to adopt standards for each subject area, grades K-12. The approved standards are on the basis of planning instructional programs in each local school system. The State Board Standards Review Policy 3.209 requires that the State Board will review all sets of academic standards at a minimum of every 8 years. The department conducted stakeholder outreach during the 2023-2024 school year to recruit subject matter experts for the following disciplines within the world language categories. Both classical languages and modern languages and their academic standards were reviewed. These subject matter experts convened in March of 2024 to recommend revisions to the world language standards. The subject matter experts included representation of elementary to high school educators, district instructional supervisors, and adjunct professors. Districts also submitted input to guide these recommendations, and best practices from professional organizations were also utilized during the revision process. This item includes revisions to the current standards document and guidance for the classical and modern languages. Changes include expanded proficiency language and guidance, expanded performance guidelines, expanded language on information related to heritage speakers, added guidance language for the seal of biliteracy, and added information about how world language supports English language arts literacy skills through skill transference. The department collected public feedback between first and final reading, which ended and concluded June 28th of 2024. One individual submitted feedback during this process. Based on the feedback, a new header was added to the middle and high school performance targets. To ensure clarity within the document, there were no other added edits between first and final reading of these standards. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on final reading, and the State Board staff concurs with this recommendation. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for world language standards. Is there a motion for action? Mr. Wells moves. Mr. Mullenhour seconds. Are there any questions? No questions. All in favor for approving world language standards? Final reading signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Dr. Wall.
Thank you.
Next item, Education Savings Account Rules 0520, 01, 16, 02, 04, 06, 08, and 11. Ms. Farrah Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and board members. My name is Farrah Williams, and I serve as the Senior Director for IEA and ESA programs with the department. I'm here today to present on final reading revision to Chapter 05200116, which outlines eligibility and participation requirements for the ESA program. The purpose of the revisions is to align the requirements for ESA participating schools with the existing requirements for categories 1, 2, and 3 non-public schools, and to provide additional clarity in select program areas to improve communication and service to ESA schools and families. The specific revisions are as follows. The requirements for criminal background checks are revised to align with existing approval requirements for categories 1, 2, and 3 non-public schools. Requirements for schools interested in participating in the ESA program are clarified to offer additional options for schools to demonstrate that they meet that financial viability requirement for participation. Currently, the rule states that a school must submit a surety bond to demonstrate financial viability, and this item adds the option for a participating school to submit a certified public accountant letter or federal tax return form to verify that financial viability. Additionally, these revisions remove references to expense reports throughout to align with how participating families access and expend their funds. Currently, the ESA team does not collect expense reports to verify how funds are spent. Instead, all expenses are pre-approved through a rigorous internal process. Once funds are approved, the account holder can then submit requests for funds disbursement for tuition fees and other allowable expenses. Finally, this item removes the requirements that the department provide notice of an appeal decision via first-class USPS mail. The department will continue to provide decisions electronically. Revisions between first and final reading clarify that notice of the department's appeal decision shall be deemed received 1 business day after the original sent date of the email. With that said, Mr. Chairman and board members, the Department of Education recommends acceptance of this item on final reading, and SBE staff concurs. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you. We have a recommendation for Education Savings Account Rules 052001, 16.02, 04, 06, 08, and 11 on final reading. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second? Mr. Jensen seconds. Are there any questions for Ms. Williams? This is a rule, so Mr. Griffin, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Albertson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen. Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour. Mr. Wells.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion passes. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Williams.
Thank you.
Next item is Board Meetings Policy 1400. Ms. Danielle Nellis.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. P. Danielle Nellis, Deputy General Counsel for the board. I have the Board Meetings Policy 1.400. This item presents revisions to our board meeting policy to remove requirements for requesting to provide public comment. The reason for this revision is because that has now been moved into rule that was heard on final reading at the last meeting and will be effective 10/10/24. There were no changes from first reading of this item to today, and the SBE staff recommends approval of this item on final reading.
Thank you. I have a recommendation for approval of Board Meetings Policy 1400. Is there a motion for action? Mr. Mullenhour moves. Is there a second? Ms. McInturf seconds the motion. Are there any questions for Ms. Nellis? No questions. All in favor for approving Board Meetings Policy 1400 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Next item is repeal interscholastic athletics rule 052001, 02, 08. Ms. Danielle Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This item proposes repealing SBE Rule 05200102-.08, and the reason for that is it is unnecessary as it's not been updated since 1986. The board also has no current authority in law to make rules governing the substance of this rule, as that authority has been shifted to local boards as well as individual public schools. I will note that restrictions on when students can be dismissed for the purpose of athletic participation is already set forth in TCA 49.6.1002, which is something that this rule also did. And we held a rulemaking hearing on this on July 25th, and there were no comments. There have been no changes made since first reading. Therefore, we recommend acceptance of this rule on final reading.
We have a recommendation to repeal interscholastic athletics rule 05200102.08. Is there a motion for action? Mr. Jensen moves. Is there a second? Ms. Johnson seconds. I heard the second. Any questions for Ms. Nellis? Mr. Griffin, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Albertson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen. Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Item passes. Next item is repeal preface rule 05200101. Ms. Nellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We all love a good preface rule. However, this one is no longer necessary and it is outdated. It merely restates the requirements set forth in state law and state constitution. Additionally, we now have our master plan that is developed per statute and revised every few years. We held a rulemaking hearing, received no public feedback. There were minor tweaks made to the statutory authority, which is more clerical than anything because it cited very old statutes because this has been around for so long. Therefore, recommend approval on final reading.
Thank you, Ms. Nellis. We have a recommendation to repeal preface rule 05200101. Is there a motion for action?
So moved.
Vice Chair Cobbins moves for repealing. Is there a second? Mr. Wells seconds. Any discussion? Mr. Griffin, please call the roll.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Albertson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion passes and the rule is repealed. Next item is State Enrollment and Attendance Guidelines Rule 05200102.17. Ms. Nellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this one is going to require or I'm going to request that there is consent on substituting the correct version of this item. It was uploaded incorrectly. I've now submitted to the board, and we have updated on our website the correct version. For context, there were no changes between the May meeting and this correct version that was uploaded. It was simply an older version that was uploaded and sent to you all. So I would ask, Mr. Chair, that you allow for the correction of that mistake.
Is there approval without objection to allow the loaded as our version to be voting on? Is there any objection to that? If there's no objection, so be it. Thank you, Ms. Nellis. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So State Board Rule 0520-01-02-.17 outlines a number of requirements found in law regarding school attendance in Tennessee. The revisions to this proposed rule move requirements for excused absences and recounting students' presence from our State Board attendance policy to rule, allowing for policy 4.100 to be repealed. There were several changes made. I note specifically the Laurel Cox law, as we so affectionately call it internally, but it allows for our State Board student member to be counted as present when serving in her capacity or his capacity, should that be the case. It also outlines that students cannot be counted as present for post-secondary school visits that occur during TCAP testing windows, and several other changes within the rule. There were no changes in this rule between first and final reading. We did hold a rulemaking hearing on this rule, and there were no comments submitted. So based on that, the staff recommends acceptance of this item on final reading.
We have a recommendation for State Enrollment Attendance Guidelines Rule 05200102.17. Is there a motion for action? Ms. Albertson, since this affects you, would you like to so move? Yes. We have a motion. Is there a second? Ms. Johnson seconds. Is there further questions? No further questions. All in favor then for approving State Enrollment and Attendance Guideline Rules 05200102.17. Roll call vote. Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Albertson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McIntyre. Aye. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
Motion passes. Next item is repeal goals and objective policy 1001. Ms. Allie Reed.
Hello again, Allie Reed, Director of Engagement and Accountability for the Board. On final reading today is an item to repeal our State Board Policy 1.001. This policy has become unnecessary as this information has moved to the State Board's master plan. Happy to take any questions.
We have a recommendation to repeal goals and objectives policy 1001. Is there a motion for action? So moved. Mr. Jensen moves. Is there a second? Ms. Maxwell seconds. Are there any questions? No questions. All in favor for repealing goals and objectives policy 1001 signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Reed. Next item, Academic Program Requirements Rule 05200103-03. Mr. Michael Dearline.
Michael Durline, Deputy Executive Director of Policy and Research with the State Board. Academic Program Requirements Rule sets the requirements for academic programming. This includes the percentage for which each end-of-course assessment counts toward a student's final grade in that course. Following feedback from multiple advocacy groups, districts, educators, students, discussion with the department, and leadership from Mr. Ryan Holt, we are proposing to move the percentage down from 15 to 25% down to 5 to 15%. State Board staff conducted a rulemaking hearing on July 25th. No comments were received, and there have been no changes to this item since first reading. Happy to take any questions you may have.
We have a recommendation for Academic Program Requirements Rule 05200103.03. Is there a motion for action? So moved. Vice Chair Cobbins moves. Is there a second? Ms. Maxwell seconds. Are there any questions for Mr. Durline? No questions. This is a rule change. Mr. Griffin, please call the roll.
Mr. Cobbins. Ms. Iverson.
Aye.
Mr. Holt. Mr. Jensen.
Aye.
Ms. Johnson.
Aye.
Ms. Maxwell.
Aye.
Ms. McInturf. Mr. Mullenhour.
Aye.
Mr. Wells. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, you have 9 ayes.
The motion passes. Next item, educator preparation providers, EPP and specialty area programs, SAP approvals. This is an item on first and final reading.
Hello, Jennifer Nelson, Senior Director of Educator Preparation. This item contains action recommendations for educator preparation providers in the specialty area programs for Bryan College, South College, and Tennessee Wesleyan University. Bryan College and South College received a comprehensive review outcome of probationary approval with major stipulations. Both EPPs participated in a focus review. Bryan College focus review took place in the fall of '23. The review team concluded that the EPP meets expectations on all the review standards, which were standards 1, 4, and 5. The provider is recommended for full approval. No specialty area programs were reviewed during the focused review. South College review took place in the fall of '23 as well. That review team concluded that the EPP meets expectation on all the reviewed standards, which were 3, 4, and 5. The provider is recommended for full approval. No specialty area programs were reviewed during that focused review. Ed Prep rule states that EPPs with full approval minor stipulation status, the department may recommend to the state board removal of the minor stipulations for the remainder of the approval period if the EPP has adequately addressed the areas in need of improvement. Department reviewers reviewed Tennessee Wesleyan University's action plan and subsequent evidence provided during annual progress monitoring reviews since 2020. The department concluded that the EPP meets expectations in all areas needing improvement and recommends removal of those minor stipulations. The EPP recommended for a status change to full approval. The Department of Education recommends approval of this item on first and final reading, and the state board staff concurs with this recommendation.
We have a recommendation for EPP and specialty area programs approval on first and final reading. Is there a motion for action? Mr. Jensen moves. Is there a second?
Second.
Vice Chair Cobbins seconds. Are there questions?
I have a question.
Yes,
on,
Mr. Jensen.
When you have schools that are in the midst of this, what is the frequency of follow-up? When you said, yeah, you're out from under it, what's the follow-up? What's the frequency of that? And how are you checking to make sure it's ongoing?
Sure, thank you for that question. It depends on what the stipulations are. It also depends on the EPP and if they have a yearly cohort, or if they have semester cohorts, so that checking in varies. We do check in at least once a year, and we do not take a recommendation to you until we believe that they fully have met. We, within the action plan, we progress monitor, so they have to provide data that shows that they're making that improvement. And then we check on them periodically until they really have those systems and structures in place to ensure. Additionally, we also monitor EPPs through the State Board report card and the annual reports.
And these are the only 3 that you currently have under? No, okay.
No, we have probably right now about 5 EPPs that are undergoing progress monitoring, either through the annual reports or comprehensive reviews.
Would it be possible at the next meeting to get a sense of who those are? Is it public or not? You hesitate.
Well, I guess they're all public. Yeah. I mean, since we are serving the state.
Yeah. I'd like to know those by the next meeting.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you just answered this, but one comment I had, it said Bryan College was partially recommended and they had implemented corrective action plan and the review showed they were making adequate progress. But how are we sure that they end up fully implementing the changes that we had?
Thank you for that question. They, within the progress monitoring or the action plan, they have to set goals and action steps, and that's what we look at, or the action steps that they do. And again, every progress monitoring, they have to provide data to those action steps. So it's really showing us that they are putting these systems and structures in place to ensure that they don't have these stipulations again.
Thank you. Other questions? We have a recommendation for education preparation providers, EPP, and special area programs, SAP approvals. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. Next item, standard setting for math and second grade English language arts. Dr. David Laird.
Good afternoon, Chairman Eby and members of the board. I'm David Laird, Assistant Commissioner for Assessment and Accountability, and I'm here to present on first and final reading an item related to standard setting for end-of-course math assessments and the optional grade 2 ELA assessment. In the spring of 23-24, the department administered updated TCAP assessments for Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Geometry, Integrated 1, 2, and 3, and the optional grade 2 ELA assessment. To complete the reporting of test scores for these assessments, it's necessary for the state board to adopt cut scores that will be used to assign students to performance levels. The cut scores recommended by the department are based on the recommendations of Tennessee educator committees who participated in a content-based standard setting process this summer. Standard setting is a qualitative review of the content standards and the tests themselves with panelists who are educators with expertise and experience in the courses under review. During the week of July 16th, 77 expert educators came together and had a series of conversations over multiple days that were instrumental in the development of the cut scores that are now proposed to the board for your approval. The department would like to take a very brief second and thank all the educators that participated in those standard setting conversations this summer. They were measured, they were thoughtful and disciplined. The department feels wonderful about their involvement in the cut scores that we're presenting to you now. And the department recommends this item on first and final reading, and the state board staff approves. I'm happy to take any additional questions.
We have a recommendation for standard settings for the end of course mathematics and optional grade 2 English language arts. Is there a motion for action? Ms. Johnson moves. Is there a second? Second. Vice Chair Cobbin seconds. Are there discussion questions? Let me just say that yesterday in the workshop, we had a very lengthy discussion, and the process that you go through to make these cut scores is very thorough, and I learned a whole lot, and I recommend anybody who has questions about it to go back and watch that video. Thank you for doing that. Originally, a lot of us had this, scores 19 out of 40, which is, less than 50% is meeting expectations. That's not how it works, and totally not how it works. I mean, it is a full process that goes through and how they decide between below, approaching, meeting, and exceeding, and I think the process is very thorough. So thank you, Dr. Laird, for doing that. Again, if people have questions, go watch the video. It's pretty telling. Any other questions or comments? No questions or comments. All in favor for the standard setting for end of course mathematics and optional grade 2 English language arts signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. That ends all of our items for final reading. Other business? Dr. Morrison, you got any comments?
Well, just thanks to everyone's efforts to make this another successful board meeting. And I want to note that our upcoming meeting is noted on the agenda for November 22nd. That will not be in Nashville. This is our away meeting. We'll be meeting in West Tennessee. So kudos over here for helping us figure out our logistics, but we're going to be meeting at the TCAT Stanton, which is co-located there with Blue Oval City. So that's going to be a really great opportunity for us to continue these conversations about education through workforce and the partnerships that requires.
Any other final comments from any board members? Again, I want to thank all the presenters and thank all the board members. It was a very full 2 days. I think we made a lot of good progress, and carry on, and we'll see you in a couple of months. Thank you. Meeting is adjourned.
Good job, Chairman.
Yeah, a little bit late.
Not too bad.